Hello, and welcome back to another evening together. Tonight, we're going to spend a long time in a world that, if you're anything like me, you've probably visited more than once. A world of Miami sunsets and blood orange slices and a very particular kind of man who drives his boat out across Biscayne Bay while the rest of the city goes about its evening, completely unaware of what's tucked beneath the water's surface. We're talking about Dexter, all of it, the full thing. Now, I want to be clear about what tonight's video is and what it isn't, because that framing matters quite a lot for how we're going to spend the next few hours together. This is not a recap. We're not going to work through every plot point in chronological order, summarizing episodes like a Wikipedia entry read aloud. That's not what this is. What this is, I think, is more like the kind of conversation you have when you've finished a show and you find yourself still thinking about it a week later. The kind of conversation where you drift sideways into production details and character psychology and little behind-the-scenes facts that reframe what you thought you understood. That kind of conversation. Tonight we're going to talk about the lore of Dexter, the deeper texture of it, the backstory of characters, the history of the world the show built, the strange, specific details that you only notice when you sit with something long enough, how the show was made and by whom and under what circumstances, where the franchise has gone since the original finale and what it's becoming now. And along the way, I'll share what I genuinely think about all of it. The highs, the lows, the things that still hold up, and the things that really don't. A quick note before we get settled. If you enjoy this kind of late-night, long-form content and you'd like to see more of it, subscribing to the channel is the best way to do that. It takes about 2 seconds and it genuinely helps. But now, more importantly, get comfortable. Settle in. If you're in bed, get the pillow right. If you got a drink, sort that out now. We're going to be here for a while. So, Dexter, the show premiered on Showtime in October 2006, and it arrived somewhat quietly, as prestige cable dramas often do. Not with a massive cultural splash, but with the slow accumulation of word of mouth that good television earns. By the time it reached its 4th season in 2009, it was being called one of the best shows on television. By the time it ended in 2013, it had become one of the most divisively discussed finales in the history of the medium. And then, 8 years later, it came back. And the comeback was, against all reasonable expectation, very good. The franchise now spans, and this is genuinely staggering to say out loud, 126 episodes across 11 seasons and multiple decades of television. The original series ran for 96 episodes across 8 seasons. Then came New Blood in 2021, a 10-episode limited series that effectively functioned as both a sequel and a corrective. Then Original Sin, a 10-episode prequel set in 1991, which premiered in late 2024 and ran into early 2025. And then Resurrection, which began airing in 2025 and has already had its 2nd season ordered. That is a remarkable amount of creative territory to cover, and most of it is genuinely worth exploring. Even the bits that are uneven, which we will get to in their own time, are uneven in interesting ways. The whole thing started, in the loosest sense, with a novel. Jeff Lindsay published Darkly Dreaming Dexter in 2004, a book about a forensic bloodstain analyst in Miami who moonlights as a vigilante serial killer. Lindsay had apparently been mulling a character like this for years, partially inspired by a Brazilian serial killer named Pedro Rodrigues Filho, who operated in the 1970s and exclusively targeted other criminals. The idea of a killer with a moral framework, a predator with a code, was the seed. Showtime optioned the book, and James Manos Jr. adapted it for television. The first season of the show tracks closely to the events of the first novel. After that, the show and the books diverge almost completely. Lindsay continued writing Dexter novels for years alongside the television series, developing a parallel universe of the same character that went in rather different directions. The television show chose its own path, and what a path it was. We'll get into all of it tonight, the people behind it, the characters within it, the world it built, and the mythology it accumulated over nearly 2 decades. We'll talk about Harry Morgan and his code, and the strange, unsettling love story at the center of a father and the monster he made. We'll talk about Miami Metro and the people who worked there, most of whom were trying in their own ways to do good police work in a building that had a serial killer on staff. We'll talk about the villains, because Dexter's antagonists, at their best, are mirrors, and the best of them are genuinely extraordinary television. And we'll talk about what came after the original finale and where the franchise is now. There is a lot to cover. Let's take our time with it. Let me start with the world itself, because I think the world of Dexter is one of the things the show does best and one of the things that doesn't always get enough credit when people talk about what made it work. Miami Metro Homicide is not just a setting, it's a character. And I mean that in the slightly cliched but genuinely accurate way. The department has its own rhythms, its own social ecosystem, its own logic, and its own very particular sense of irony, which is that it is technically the most dangerous place for Dexter to exist, and also the place where he is, for most of the series, most safe. Because hiding in plain sight inside a police department means that no one ever really suspects you of being exactly what you are. The show was set in Miami, but here's a detail that always tickles me a little. Most of it was not filmed there. The pilot used real Miami locations, including actual shots around Bay Harbor Islands for the exterior of Dexter's apartment building. But after that, production relocated almost entirely to Southern California. A residential neighborhood in Long Beach stood in for the Miami streets throughout most of the original series. The crew dressed the palm tree-lined streets of Long Beach in the bright, pastel-washed aesthetic of South Florida, and for the most part, it worked. You'd never know unless someone told you, which I suppose is a testament to how little any of us were paying attention to the specific geography. There is something mildly amusing about the fact that a show so defined by its Miami identity was largely a California production. The heat, the humidity, the sense of a city that exists slightly outside the normal rules. All of that was constructed on sound stages and suburban streets a few thousand miles from where the story was supposed to be happening. Season 1 had an additional complication. Early filming was affected by the hurricane season of 2005. Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, and Wilma all disrupted scheduling at various points during pre-production and early shooting, which is the kind of chaotic footnote that makes you appreciate how well the final product came together. And Season 1 has a very specific visual texture that is different from everything that followed. The first season was shot on 35mm film, which gives it a gritty, heavily saturated quality. Slightly warm, slightly grainy, with the kind of depth that film stock provides and that digital formats struggled to replicate for years. Starting with Season 2, the show transitioned to digital, and you can feel the difference. The later seasons are cleaner, brighter, more clinical. Whether that's a better or worse aesthetic is genuinely a matter of taste, but I think there's something in the first season's look that suits the material particularly well. It feels handmade, imperfect in a way that feels intentional. But let me talk about the people in the building, because they deserve proper attention. Maria LaGuerta, played by Lauren Velez, she's the lieutenant of homicide for most of the series, and she is a genuinely complicated character in a way that the show is not always given credit for handling well. LaGuerta is ambitious, she is political, she is occasionally willing to bend the truth to protect people she cares about, and she is occasionally willing to sacrifice people she doesn't. She is not a villain, she is not exactly a hero, she is a person trying to survive in an institution while also trying to maintain something like integrity, and those two things are not always compatible. Her relationship with Angel Batista, a working friendship that eventually becomes a romantic one, and then a marriage, and then a divorce, is one of the more human subplots the show sustains across multiple seasons. Angel Batista, played by David Zayas, is probably my favorite supporting character in the entire run. He is warm in a way that very few characters in crime dramas are allowed to be. He is funny without being comic relief. He is competent. He genuinely cares about the people around him. And his friendship with Dexter is one of the show's persistent, quiet ironies. Because Angel is, in almost every meaningful way, a good man, and he spends years befriending and championing someone who is, by any objective standard, a serial killer. The fact that he eventually becomes a major character in New Blood and Resurrection, now knowing the full truth about Dexter, is enormously satisfying. Vince Masuka, played by C.S. Lee, is the forensics tech. He was initially a recurring character, promoted to the main cast starting with Season 2. And he functions throughout the series as both comic relief and a surprisingly capable professional. Masuka's jokes are almost always inappropriate. His enthusiasm for his work is genuine. His affection for Dexter is consistent and uncomplicated. And there's something interesting in the fact that this is one of the few characters who never suspects Dexter of anything, whose relationship with him is straightforwardly positive for the entire run. because Masuka simply isn't oriented toward suspicion. He's oriented toward the lab. Joey Quinn, played by Desmond Harrington, is a more interesting character than he sometimes gets credit for being. He was introduced as a recurring character in Season 3 and promoted to the main cast for Season 4 onwards. Quinn operates with a flexible relationship to the rules that could, in the wrong framing, make him seem like a corrupt cop, and the show does occasionally push in that direction. But what's actually being portrayed, I think, is something more nuanced. Quinn is someone who understands that the formal procedures of policing sometimes get in the way of what the formal procedures are supposed to accomplish. His relationship with Deborah and the way it develops and falls apart and reconfigures across several seasons is one of the series' more grounded emotional threads. And then there is James Dokes, played by Eric King, who is in many ways the most important supporting character in the original series, and the one whose departure leaves the biggest hole. Dokes is an ex-Army Special Forces sergeant. He has killed people in the line of duty in circumstances that were morally murky in ways that stayed with him. And when he looks at Dexter, he sees something that nobody else in the department can perceive. Not because he has evidence or a theory, but because he has a frame of reference. He knows what it looks like when a person has done violence and felt something about it that they shouldn't have felt. Dexter's own internal monologue addresses this directly and unforgettably in the very first episode, when he asks himself why, in a building full of people supposedly trained to read human behavior, Dokes is the only one who gives him the creeps. It is a question that hangs over the first 2 seasons like a weather pattern. And the answer the show eventually provides, Dokes is right about everything and he dies because of it, is one of the sadder outcomes in the series. Now let me talk briefly about what Dexter actually does at work, because it's worth understanding the mechanics of the job and why it provides such perfect cover. Blood spatter analysis, or bloodstain pattern analysis to give it its proper name, is the forensic discipline of examining the shape, size, distribution, and position of blood at a crime scene to determine what happened. Different types of bloodshed produce different patterns. A gunshot wound produces a very different pattern from a bludgeoning. A body that was moved after death leaves traces that a body left in situ does not. The distance, the angle, the velocity, all of it is legible in the blood if you know how to read it. Dexter knows how to read it better than anyone in Miami Metro, possibly better than anyone in the state of Florida. And he is also simultaneously generating the exact patterns he's trained to analyze. He knows what evidence to clean, what traces to leave, and which to destroy, and which elements of a scene will deflect investigators in the wrong direction. His professional expertise and his secret life are the same expertise. The job and the killing are the same skill set, oriented in opposite directions. Think about that for a second. The man who investigates murder scenes is using the knowledge from those scenes to commit murders more efficiently. Miami Metro essentially subsidizes his kills. The department's resources, databases, forensic labs, case files on criminal histories feed directly into the operation he's running in his spare time. And yet nobody thought to look too closely. For 17 years. The irony of Miami Metro as an institution is something the show returns to again and again. And I think it's worth being honest about the fact that the department is, in narrative terms, not especially effective. This is not a criticism of the show. It is a narrative necessity. The show would end in the first season if Miami Metro were genuinely competent at finding Dexter. But there is something almost affectionate in the way the series stages the department's various near misses and wrong conclusions. The one time someone does put everything together, it is Maria LaGuerta in Season 7. And the show treats this with complete seriousness. She is right, she knows she is right. And the reason she doesn't survive to act on it has nothing to do with incompetence. But we'll get to that when the time comes. For now, let's back up quite a long way, because to understand Dexter Morgan, the man who sits in that lab, who smiles that particular smile, who brings donuts on a Friday morning, you need to understand how he came to exist. And that story starts not in Miami Metro. It starts in a shipping container on a cold evening in 1973 when a 2-year-old boy sat in a pool of his mother's blood and waited to be found. The backstory of Dexter Morgan is one of those things that the show reveals gradually, in fragments, across multiple seasons. We get pieces of it in Season 1, more in Season 2. a significant revision in Season 8. And then Original Sin, the prequel series, fills in what the original show only gestured toward. Taken together, it is a rich and genuinely affecting history, a tragedy dressed up as an origin story. Laura Moser was a confidential informant for the Miami Metro Police Department in the early 1970s. She was working with a detective named Harry Morgan, young, committed, genuinely trying to do good in a city that could be brutal in ways the department was only beginning to understand. Harry and Laura had an affair. It is not presented as a simple, shallow thing. It clearly meant something to both of them. And it complicated everything that followed because Laura had two sons, Brian, the older boy, who was her child from a previous relationship, and Dexter, who was Harry's biological son, though this was not something Harry ever made public. Laura was killed in December of 1973. 3 drug traffickers, Santos Jimenez, Juan Renas, and Joe Driscoll, murdered her in a shipping container at the port of Miami. She had apparently been too close to incriminating them, and they dealt with the situation in the way that people who think of other people as problems generally deal with problems. Brian was 7 years old. Dexter was 2. The 2 boys were locked in the container with their mother's body for 3 days before anyone found them. Harry Morgan was the one who got the call. He arrived at the container, and when they opened it, Dexter was sitting in the blood. Quiet, not crying, just sitting there, in the middle of what had happened to his mother with an expression that Harry, by his own later account, found impossible to read. That image, the small child in the blood, is the show's foundational image. Everything else in Dexter's story radiates outward from that container. The show returns to it in flashback so often, from so many different angles, that it becomes almost mythological. The shipping container is to Dexter what the alley behind the theater is to Batman, except the creators of Dexter have the good taste not to announce that comparison themselves. Harry made a decision that day that shaped the next 40 years of the story. He took Dexter, he and his wife Doris adopted the boy and raised him as their own. And he left Brian as the older child, the one who remembered more, the one who was already showing signs of severe psychological damage in the system. Brian eventually ended up institutionalized. This decision is presented with a certain amount of narrative compassion toward Harry, because Harry clearly loved Dexter and because the choice, from Harry's perspective, may have seemed like a practical one. Brian was older, more visibly traumatized, already difficult to manage. Dexter was too. There was perhaps still time to shape what Dexter would become. And yet the abandonment of Brian Moser is one of the moral stains at the center of the show's universe. Harry chose one child over another. He visited Brian in the institution, we eventually learn, kept tabs on him, watched him deteriorate, and still did not bring him home, still did not try. The consequences of this decision show up in Season 1. In ways that are genuinely devastating, but let's stay with young Dexter for now, and with Harry's recognition of what was happening inside the boy he was raising. It started with animals. This is not something the show makes up. It is a genuine forensic observation, a well-documented early indicator in the behavioral profiles of individuals who go on to commit violence. Young Dexter killed a neighbor's dog. Harry caught him in the act of something similar not long after. And rather than seeking psychiatric intervention, rather than bringing in therapists or putting Dexter in a program of any kind, Harry made another choice. And this one is the one the entire franchise runs on. He decided to channel it rather than suppress it. The Code of Harry, as it comes to be known, is essentially an ethical framework for a serial killer. Its 2 primary rules are elegantly simple. Dexter may only kill people who are guilty beyond a reasonable doubt and who have escaped the formal justice system. And Dexter must never be caught. The first rule is about justice. The second is about survival. Together, they are supposed to make Dexter both useful to society and invisible within it. Harry spent years teaching Dexter how to hunt. He used his own access to police record, which was considerable since he was a highly placed officer, to help Dexter identify appropriate targets. He taught Dexter how to be certain of guilt before acting. He taught him the forensics of concealment, how to dispose of evidence, how to move through the world without leaving a trace. He was, in the most literal possible sense, training his son in the craft. And Dexter's first human kill, as established by the show's own flashbacks, was a man named Neil Perry, a suspected child killer in the neighborhood. Harry selected the target. Dexter did what he had been trained to do. Now, here is where Season 8 complicates the picture in a way that is worth sitting with. For 7 seasons, the Code of Harry is presented as Harry's invention. A loving, if profoundly unorthodox gift from a father who understood his child in a way no one else could. It feels personal. It feels like something Harry constructed out of desperation and love in roughly equal measure. Then Dr. Evelyn Vogel arrives. She is a neuropsychiatrist played by Charlotte Rampling, and she reveals that she helped Harry build the code. Harry had come to her because he didn't know what to do. He had a child who he could see was going to become something, and he didn't know how to redirect it. Vogel, who had spent her career studying psychopathy, helped him design the framework. She had theories about people like Dexter, what she calls, in her more clinical moments, a new kind of human being. And the code was, at least in part, an experiment in what happens when you give such a person a structured outlet and a moral rule set. This reframes the code significantly. It is still an act of love in some sense, but it is also something designed by a professional, tested like a hypothesis applied to a child. Harry was the father, Vogel was the architect, and Dexter was the subject. There is another layer to Harry's story that the show reveals in Season 2, and it is one of the darker revelations in the original run. Dexter has believed his entire life that Harry died of heart disease. This was the official story. This was what everyone was told. The truth is that Harry killed himself. Deputy Chief Tom Matthews reveals this to Dexter in a quiet, devastating scene. Harry had come home one evening and found Dexter in the middle of something. He saw what the code had produced in practice. Not as an abstraction, not as a theory, but as a physical reality, as a corpse being processed in a space where his son was at work. And Harry vomited and told Dexter to stay away from him. And 3 days later, he was dead. The official autopsy showed he had overdosed on his heart medication. Matthews buried the report to protect Dexter and Deborah. What this means is that Harry spent years building something, and then, the first time he truly saw it, it broke him. He could not live with what he had made. He could not reconcile the theory of the code with the reality of the kill room. The father who had given Dexter everything, the framework, the training, the permission, in the end could not bear to be in the same room with what that permission had produced. Dexter's grief about this, when he learns it, is complicated and largely internalized. He doesn't rage, he doesn't collapse. He processes it the way he processes most difficult information. Through the filter of his own internal narration, turning it over, looking at it from different angles, trying to locate himself in relation to it. One of the show's more interesting recurring devices is the hallucinated Harry, a version of Harry's voice and image that Dexter conjures in moments of stress or confusion, who functions as a kind of conscience by proxy, or sometimes as a sounding board, or sometimes as an adversary. This hallucinated Harry continues as a presence throughout the series, and it is significantly different from the real Harry in ways that are worth noticing. The hallucinated Harry is steadier, more certain, less haunted. He is the version of the father that Dexter needed rather than the version that actually existed. Original Sin, the 2024 prequel series set in 1991, gives us a very different Harry. Christian Slater plays him, a casting choice that on paper seems odd and in practice works rather well. Slater brings a warmth and a slight uncertainty to the role that reads as exactly right for a man who is improvising a parenting strategy in real time. The Harry of Original Sin is not the mythologized figure that Dexter's internal monologue has constructed. He is a person. He second-guesses himself. He is trying. The distance between this version and the hallucinated Harry of the main series is one of the more quietly poignant elements of the franchise. And Deborah. We should mention Deborah here because she exists in this origin story too. Deborah Morgan is Harry's biological daughter, which means she is Dexter's adoptive sister. She grew up in the same house. She loved the same father. She is, in some ways, the other product of Harry's choices. Not his designed experiment, but the collateral child. The one who grew up in close proximity to a secret she didn't have access to. Harry's decision to adopt Dexter rather than seek institutional care for him shaped Deborah's entire life too. She grew up with a brother who was different in ways she couldn't name, in a household where something was always slightly off. in the shadow of a father who had divided his love in complicated ways. Her arc across the original series, from eager detective to compromised lieutenant, is in many ways the story of someone being slowly consumed by a secret they were never supposed to have to hold. But again, we'll get to that in its own time. For now, what matters is the container, and Harry and the boy who came out of it already carrying something that Harry spent the rest of his life trying to contain. And that brings us to the mechanics of the life that was built around all of that. The code, the kill room, the ritual, the dark passenger. There is a reason the kill room scenes in Dexter have become a kind of cultural shorthand. They are staged with such consistent, almost meditative deliberateness. The unfurling of the plastic sheeting, the careful preparation of the table, the precise arrangement of the photographs, that they have their own visual grammar, recognizable after a single viewing. They look like a ritual because they are one. And rituals, whether they're sacred or secular or deeply unsettling, have a way of being compelling to watch precisely because of their formality. Let me walk through what actually happens because the specifics are worth knowing. When Dexter identifies a target, someone who has killed, who is guilty beyond reasonable doubt, who has slipped through the formal justice system, the process that follows is methodical to a degree that borders on compulsive. The kill room is almost always prepared in advance. Plastic sheeting goes down on every surface, walls and floors, to contain forensic trace. The target is rendered unconscious beforehand, typically via injection. Ketamine is the drug that features most prominently across the series, though Dexter adapts based on circumstances. The target is then restrained on a table, wrists and ankles and chest secured, completely immobile. Then Dexter sits. He waits for them to wake up. And when they do, he shows them. Whatever evidence he has assembled, photographs, case files, the specific details of what they have done, he presents it. This moment is important. Dexter does not kill silently or efficiently in the way you might expect a practical man to operate. He needs the confrontation. He needs the acknowledgement. He needs the victim to know that he knows and to understand why they are on the table. Whether this is about justice, about psychology, or about something darker and harder to name, is a question the show deliberately leaves open. After each kill, there is one more step. Dexter takes a blood slide, a single glass slide pressed to the victim's cheek, collecting a drop of blood. These are then stored in a wooden box, which for most of the original series lives inside the air conditioning unit of Dexter's apartment. A climate-controlled hiding spot that is, on reflection, not quite as impenetrable as Dexter seems to believe. The blood slide collection is the most reckless thing Dexter does. Full stop. It is the one element of his operation that makes no practical sense and serves no functional purpose. He doesn't need them for anything. They are trophies in the way that serial killers collect trophies, which is precisely what Dexter is even when he is also functioning as a vigilante. He keeps them because he needs them, a record of what he is and what he has done, held in secret, touched occasionally, never shown to anyone. In Season 7, Maria LaGuerta finds one at a crime scene, a slide that was left in the wreckage after a kill Dexter attempted near the Bay Harbor, and it triggers the investigation that nearly ends everything. This is, of course, the irony of the collection. The one thing he keeps for purely personal reasons is the one thing that could most directly destroy him. The blood slides are also a beautiful piece of character writing, if you're in the business of looking at things that way. They say something very specific about Dexter's relationship with his own nature. He claims throughout the series that the killing is a compulsion, something he must do, not something he chooses. And yet the collection is a choice. The collection is vanity. The collection is the behavior of someone who is, on some level, proud of what they do, which complicates the compulsion narrative considerably. Now let me talk about the dark passenger, because that concept is central to understanding how Dexter thinks about himself and how the show wants us to think about him. The dark passenger is the term Dexter uses to describe the thing inside him that drives the need to kill. It is presented, at first, almost as a separate entity, something that lives alongside him rather than within him. Something that arrived in the shipping container, got into him too early before he was fully formed. He speaks of it the way a devout person might speak of a possessing spirit, or the way an addict might speak of the pull toward their particular substance. It is bigger than him. It is outside his control. It tells him what to do, and he follows. This framing is very important to Dexter. It is, I think, the story he tells himself in order to remain bearable to himself. If the Dark Passenger is a separate force, then Dexter is not fully responsible for what he does. He is a host, not an author. The monster lives inside him, and he is its unfortunate vehicle. Hannah McKay is the first character to really push back on this, and she does it in a way that lands with unusual precision. Hannah, who is herself a killer, deliberate, calculated, unbothered by guilt, simply doesn't buy the Dark Passenger as a framework. She looks at Dexter and sees someone who wants to kill and does it, not someone being driven by an external force. Just a person who wants something and follows through on that want. Her exact words in one of their early conversations, "It's just you. You're the one who wants the arsonist dead, and I don't blame you. Who wouldn't?" And Dexter insists. The difference, he says, is that a lot of people feel like they want to kill somebody, but he has to follow through. The Dark Passenger leaves him no choice. And Hannah says, "I follow through and I don't have a Dark Passenger." Later, in one of the hallucinatory conversations with imaginary Harry, the issue gets pushed even further. Harry tells Dexter that the Dark Passenger was always Dexter's own invention. Harry gave him the code, the Dark Passenger came from Dexter, and then Harry says something that I find rather devastating in its simplicity. "It sure is a whole lot simpler to just pin all the blame on something else, isn't it, Dexter? It's much scarier to think that the Dark Passenger is no more real than I am." Think about that for a second. The hallucinated Harry, who is himself not real, telling Dexter that the Dark Passenger is also not real. Both of them figments, both of them stories that Dexter tells himself. The guilt, the compulsion, the separate entity, all of it potentially a narrative constructed to avoid the far more frightening conclusion that Dexter chooses this, freely, every time. The show never resolves this question definitively. It keeps both possibilities alive. And I think that is, actually, the right choice. A definitive answer in either direction would be less interesting than the sustained ambiguity. Back to the code itself and how it changes over time, because it does change significantly by the end. As we covered earlier, the code's foundation was those two rules: exclusivity and survival, justice and concealment. And in Season 1, those rules hold with a rigidity that is almost touching. Dexter does not deviate. Then Season 3 happens, and Oscar Prado is killed in what is effectively self-defense during a planned kill gone wrong. Oscar was not guilty of anything relevant. He pulled a knife. Dexter acted. The first crack appears in the code's purity. By Season 5, Dexter is helping Lumen Pierce kill men from her personal list of abusers, operating on her word and her testimony rather than his own independent verification. He is taking her account as sufficient evidence. This is a further drift. By Season 7, Deborah Morgan knows everything and is actively helping to conceal Dexter's activities. The code has expanded into a family enterprise. There is a scene where Dexter and Deborah sit together and work through what happened to LaGuerta, who absolutely must not survive the season. And this is as far from the original code as you can get, while still nominally claiming to follow it. And then New Blood, set roughly a decade after the original finale, shows us something we haven't seen before. Dexter without the code in active operation. He has suppressed the killing entirely for approximately 10 years. He lives as Jim Lindsay, sells sporting goods, attends church functions in a small town in upstate New York. The Dark Passenger, by whatever name you want to give it, has been in a kind of enforced dormancy. When it reawakens, as it inevitably does, the code reasserts itself fairly quickly. But the decade of suppression raises an interesting question that New Blood never quite answers. Was the code always necessary, or was Dexter capable of more control than he, or Harry or Vogel, ever believed? His 10 years of stillness suggest at least the possibility of genuine choice. I don't know. I don't think the show knows either, but it's a question worth sitting with. Since we're talking about the mechanisms of Dexter's world, let me also just briefly mention the practical architecture of how his double life works day to day, because it is more elaborate than it sometimes looks. The forensics job gives him cover and access. The job means he has legitimate reasons to be at crime scenes, to handle evidence, to know what investigative priorities are at any given moment. He can monitor his own cases from the inside. He can redirect suspicion if it starts moving in the wrong direction. His social life, the girlfriends, the eventual marriage to Rita, the children, provides normalcy. A person with a girlfriend who has children from a previous marriage and a good job and friends at work does not read, at first or second or even 10th glance, as the Bay Harbor butcher. The ordinariness is protective. Dexter constructs and maintains that ordinariness with considerable effort and genuine discomfort because he finds most social interaction deeply confusing and somewhat exhausting. And the boat matters. The slice of life, Dexter's boat, which he keeps at a marina and takes out regularly, is the mechanism by which the bodies disappear. Dexter chops his victims, wraps them in bin bags, loads them onto the boat, and disposes of them at sea. It is a system that worked for approximately 17 years before a dive school discovered the dump site in Season 2, which is, if you think about the logistics, an extraordinary run. In any real city with any real marine forensics presence, the volume of material going into Biscayne Bay over 17 years would have created anomalies that investigators would eventually notice. But Dexter's luck and Miami Metro's investigative reach existed in a kind of mutually convenient balance for a very long time. The boat also becomes a symbol. At the end of the original series, it's the boat Dexter drives into the hurricane when he decides to disappear. It is the last image of the life he built, vanishing into the storm. Rather poetic as endings go, even if what follows it is rather less so. But we should begin at the beginning of the story the show actually tells us. Season 1, The Ice Truck Killer. A series of bloodless, carefully arranged crime scenes that are not, as Miami Metro eventually realizes, designed for the city at all. They are designed for one person, one specific audience of one. Let's talk about Brian Moser. One of the things I find genuinely fascinating about the kill room as a concept, and this is the kind of detail that repays extended thought, is how consistent the ritual is across the course of the show, even as Dexter himself changes significantly. The early kill rooms have a quality of newness to them. The setup is careful, but slightly tentative. By the middle of the series, the ritual has the fluency of long practice, each element placed with a confidence that comes from having done something many times. And in the later seasons, particularly in New Blood, where Dexter has been away from the practice for a decade, there is a quality of reacquaintance. The hands remember, the muscle memory is still there. The ritual takes hold almost immediately, even after years of dormancy. This is interesting for what it says about the relationship between identity and practice. For Dexter, the kill room is not simply a mechanism. It is also a place where he is most fully himself, or rather, where the performance of not being himself is suspended. Everywhere else, he is managing the gap between what he is and what he appears to be. In the kill room, there is no gap. The room is built around who he actually is. The plastic sheeting, the table, the photographs, these are the props of the only identity that requires no performance. And this is why I think the ritual stays so consistent even as other things in Dexter's life change dramatically. The marriages and the children and the careers and the moral compromises and the geographical moves, all of these shift and evolve. The kill room stays essentially the same. It is the fixed point. Let me also talk about a specific detail of the code that I think gets under-examined, which is the verification process. Before any kill, Dexter is supposed to have confirmed guilt beyond a reasonable doubt by his own assessment. This is not the same as legal guilt. Legal guilt requires evidence that meets courtroom standards, that can withstand cross-examination, that a jury can evaluate. Dexter's standard is different. It is personal certainty, informed by access to police files, crime scenes, and his own forensic expertise. But ultimately, it is a subjective judgment made by a single person operating entirely outside any system of oversight or appeal. This matters because, as the show itself eventually acknowledges, Dexter is wrong about this. Not dramatically, not frequently, but the possibility that his certainty might be mistaken is something the code does not adequately account for. Harry built in the beyond reasonable doubt standard as a way to prevent random violence, but doubt, by definition, is in the eye of the doubter. A person who has constructed a moral framework to permit killing can, consciously or unconsciously, construct certainty to justify a specific kill. The code contains the seed of its own corruption. The blood slides are the most obvious example of this problem made physical. Each slide represents a certainty acted upon. 38 bags on the ocean floor, the contents of which are all people Dexter was sure about. They are also a collection of human beings who were killed without trial, without appeal, without any external review of whether the certainty that put them on the table was actually warranted. The code sounds clean. The slides, as an artifact, are not. I've always thought that this is one of the show's more quietly radical gestures. To make the trophy collection the clearest evidence of the code's moral problem. Dexter keeps the slides because they are his. They belong to him. He made them, and the possessiveness he feels toward them. The fact that he risks everything to maintain them, that losing them would feel like losing something of himself, is precisely what a true believer in the code should be alarmed by. There is also the question of the victims themselves. Not Dexter's kills, but the victims of the people Dexter kills. The show is careful, especially in the early seasons, to establish these victims. The cold case files, the photographs, the witness accounts. Dexter assembles them not simply to verify guilt, but, the narration suggests, to make his kills feel purposeful. The victim becomes part of the ritual too, in a sense. The confrontation in the kill room, where Dexter presents the evidence of what his target has done, is partly about justice and partly about something else. The need to make the kill feel like something more than appetite. Whether it is or not is the show's central unresolved question. And it stays unresolved because the honest answer is almost certainly both. The kill is both appetite and something more. Dexter cannot separate them. The code does not separate them. Harry could not separate them either, which is why he could not bear to be in the room with what the code had produced. Let me spend a little more time with the specific texture of Arthur Mitchell's family life, because it is one of the more carefully constructed aspects of the season's design, and one that doesn't always get its due. Arthur Mitchell's wife Sally, played by Juliana Harkavy, is a character the show treats with more care than she might initially appear to receive. She is quiet, careful, often on the edge of something she doesn't quite allow herself to articulate. She has been with Arthur for decades. She knows on some level that something is wrong, has known it long enough that the knowledge has become structural, part of how she moves through the world. She never explicitly names what she knows. The show is accurate about this in a way that feels specific. People who live with sustained, chronic fear of someone they love do not always name the fear. They manage it. They navigate around it. They develop strategies that look, from the outside, like passivity or complicity, but are actually sophisticated survival mechanisms. Their daughter Rebecca has the bright, slightly fixed quality of someone who has learned to perform happiness in service of keeping the peace. Their son Jonah has a different coping strategy, a kind of rigid withdrawal, a sense of having retreated to somewhere inside himself where Arthur can't quite reach. The Mitchell children are not fully developed characters in the way the main cast are, but they are precisely drawn. They are evidence in the most textured possible form that the family facade is a fiction. What Dexter's looking for, the template for how to be both what he is and what he appears to be simultaneously, is not present in this house. What is present is the inevitable cost of trying. Arthur Mitchell did not achieve the balance Dexter imagined. He achieved an arrangement, a structure in which the people closest to him bore the weight of his secret silently and continuously at enormous personal cost, and had no choice in the matter. The irony that Dexter spends time in this household trying to learn how to be better at his own domestic life, while the household he is studying is itself a crime scene operating in slow motion, is one of the things that makes Season 4's central conceit so rich. Kyle Butler's the cover identity, but what Kyle Butler's doing in the Mitchell house is learning the wrong lesson from the wrong teacher, while both of them, entirely without knowing it, are about to collide. Arthur sees Kyle Butler as a younger version of something he recognizes. He is not sure what, precisely. Arthur is self-aware enough to perceive that there is a kinship between them, not aware enough to understand its exact nature. He mentors Kyle in the way that people with secrets sometimes mentor others, with genuine feeling and also with the subliminal pleasure of having someone who seems to be where you once were, still innocent of what the life you built actually costs. And Kyle, Dexter, plays the eager student, which comes naturally to him because in a very real sense, he is one. He wants to know what Arthur knows. He is wrong about what the knowledge is. And by the time he understands his error, The season's climax has already been set in motion. One more detail worth sitting with: the hammer. Arthur gives Kyle a hammer during one of their Habitat for Humanity sessions. Dexter takes it, uses it eventually in a kill. The hammer passes from Arthur's hands to Dexter's through an act of generosity, and then functions as a weapon, which is not an incidental detail in a show this interested in what fathers pass down to what they create. I want to stay with Deborah's arc across Season 7 a little longer because I think it is the most underappreciated, sustained character work in the original series' final act. The thing about Deborah's Season 7 is that she is simultaneously in the worst situation of her life and, for the first time, in possession of the full picture. She knows. She has the truth. And the truth is, from a certain angle, worse than any version of events she might have imagined in the years of sensing that something was off about her brother. The monster you can see clearly is more immediately devastating than the one you can only feel. Jennifer Carpenter has spoken in interviews about the Season 7 material being some of the most demanding she did on the show. And it shows, not in the sense of strain or effortfulness, but in the specific way that complex emotional states coexist in each scene. Deborah is angry, she is grieving, she is complicit, she is trying to maintain a professional identity, lieutenant of homicide at Miami Metro, while personally protecting the most active serial killer in the department's history from the department's own investigation. The cognitive dissonance this requires is visible in her physicality throughout the season. She moves differently, she holds herself differently. She is a person who has been handed a weight she was not built to carry and is carrying it anyway. The dynamic between Deborah and Hannah McKay this season is worth noting separately, because it adds a specific kind of pressure to Deborah's position. Deborah knows Hannah is a killer. She has the instinct, backed by evidence, that Hannah has been poisoning people for years. She wants Hannah arrested. She wants Hannah in prison. And Dexter is sleeping with Hannah, protecting Hannah, and beginning to plan a future with Hannah. This puts Deborah in the position of being the only person in the Central Triangle who is trying to enforce the rules, who is insisting, despite everything, that the law should function as the law. She has already crossed the line of helping cover up Dexter's kills. But Hannah is a different category of problem because Hannah is a person Deborah can actually arrest and prosecute, and Dexter is actively preventing that. In any real investigation, and I want to use this framing because it matters here, Deborah's knowledge of Dexter and her simultaneous management of a case involving Hannah McKay would create irreconcilable professional conflicts of interest. A detective with Deborah's knowledge of one suspected killer protecting that killer while nominally investigating another is not in a sustainable position. The show allows her to occupy this position for a full season through the grace of Deborah's exceptional compartmentalization skills and the specific fiction that she is still, despite everything, a good cop. She is trying to be. The effort is visible, and the failure of it, the moment LaGuardia is shot, the moment the law she has spent her career serving is finally, catastrophically, inverted in her own hands, is the most quietly devastating thing the season does. Let me spend a little more time with Harrison's arc in New Blood because it is more nuanced than a simple son discovers father is a monster trajectory. Harrison arrives in Iron Lake with a set of things he has never named to anyone. The violence in his history, the foster homes, the fights, the specific reputation that precedes him wherever he goes, is not presented by the show as obviously connected to his heritage. It is presented as the product of circumstances. A child whose mother was murdered, whose father disappeared, who grew up at the edges of other people's lives. The environment created the behavior, or so it seems. But what New Blood tracks slowly and carefully is the emergence of something that Harrison himself can feel is not entirely explained by circumstance. He is good at fighting in a way that goes beyond what self-defense in foster care would produce. He has a tolerance for his own pain that is unusual. And he is drawn, without quite understanding why, toward situations that other people would step away from. The wrestling storyline is where this becomes most visible. Sergeant Logan, who later dies, which makes these earlier scenes painful in retrospect, recommends the team to Harrison. Harrison takes to it with the kind of natural aptitude that makes coaches notice. But what he takes to specifically is the moment of control, the pinning, the absolute physical domination of an opponent within the formal structure of a match. He is calm where other wrestlers are adrenalized. He is precise where others are aggressive. and Dexter recognizes this. He watches his son on the wrestling mat and sees something he recognizes from his own experience of himself: the ability to be still in a moment that demands it, the absence of the fear response that most people would have in situations of physical confrontation. This recognition is what begins the season's most complex dynamic. Dexter is trying to be a normal parent. He's trying to build something ordinary with the son he abandoned. And simultaneously, he can see in Harrison something that makes ordinary an unlikely outcome, and he is trying to work out whether to acknowledge this or to pretend it isn't there. Ethan, the nerdy, bullied student who Harrison befriends against the grain of social hierarchy, is one of New Blood's quieter successes. Harrison sees Ethan being made the target of a particularly cruel catfishing scheme by the popular boys, and he intervenes. Not because he follows rules about this, but because he recognizes that Zach and the others are using power carelessly for entertainment, and this offends something in him. His explanation to Ethan: because guys like Zach shouldn't always be top of the food chain. This is, in microcosm, the Dexter Morgan moral framework. The strong should not prey on the weak without consequence. The predator should be accountable to something. It is not the code, exactly. Harrison doesn't have a code, doesn't yet have Harry's framework or Vogel's clinical overlay. But it is a recognizable shape of the same instinct. Which is interesting, which is, to use the show's own language, something to watch. Whether Harrison will develop a dark passenger of his own, whether the thing that lives in Dexter also lives in the son who pulled the trigger, is the question that Resurrection is presumably inheriting. The franchise has now shifted its central psychological mystery from Dexter's nature to Harrison's, which is, creatively, the right direction for a story that has already told the first version of its central question as well as it could. Since we've been talking about the people behind the franchise, let me spend a bit more time with Jeff Lindsay, because the relationship between the novels and the television series is an interesting one that tends to get simplified in conversations about the show. Lindsay published Darkly Dreaming Dexter in 2004, and the book was well received enough to launch a series. By the time the television show ended in 2013, there were 7 Dexter novels in print. The television adaptation drew heavily from the first book for its first season, then diverged substantially. The novel's Dexter is, in some respects, more straightforwardly monstrous than Hall's version. He is less internally conflicted, less prone to the kind of existential narration that defines the television character. The voice is darkly comic in a way the show is too, but the television version modulates the comedy with something closer to genuine ambivalence about Dexter's nature. The novel Dexter knows what he is and is largely fine about it. The television Dexter spends 8 seasons not being entirely fine about it. Both versions are interesting, and I say this as someone who read the novel some years after watching the show. The books have a lightness to them that the show doesn't always permit itself. A breezy, slightly sardonic quality that Lindsay maintains consistently. They are genre fiction in the best sense. Efficiently constructed, enjoyable, with a distinctive voice that does not overstay its welcome. What they are not is what the show became at its best. The television Dexter acquired a weight across its run, in Hall's performance, in the serialized consequences of the code's erosion, in the specific tragedy of the Deborah relationship, that the novels, by design, do not carry. Lindsay has been, by public accounts, generally supportive of the adaptation while acknowledging the divergence. He named the Jim Lindsay alias in New Blood himself, which is either a very generous act of the source material nodding to its offspring or a quietly wry gesture of ownership, depending on how you read it. Probably both. The question of adaptation fidelity, how closely a television show should follow its source material, is one of those perennial creative debates that tends to resolve in the same direction. The best adaptations are the ones that find the spirit of the source and translate it for their specific medium, rather than the ones that track every plot point. Dexter Season 1's fidelity to the first novel is high enough to be satisfying. The subsequent season's complete divergence is what allowed the television show to develop its own mythology, its own supporting characters, its own moral architecture. A television show that had continued to follow the novels would have been a different kind of show. Whether it would have been better or worse is the kind of question that can't be answered, only speculated about. What can be said is that the television version produced Season 4, which is one of the best seasons of any drama in the prestige cable era. and that season 4 had nothing to do with the novels, which by that point had already sent Dexter in a completely different direction. The television show's willingness to become its own thing, to treat the source material as a starting point rather than a blueprint, is what gave it permission to achieve what it achieved. One more production detail I want to mention, because it is the kind of specific logistical fact that I find genuinely interesting. The show's approach to Dexter's voiceover narration, which is one of its most distinctive formal elements, required Hall to record the narration separately from the primary filming. The internal monologue that runs through so much of the show is not captured in the moment of performance, but is layered in, which creates a specific kind of tonal challenge. Hall has to match the emotional register of his on-screen performance with narration recorded in a different context, often at a different time. The consistency with which he manages this across 8 seasons, the narration always sounding like it belongs to the same person as the performance, is a technical achievement that the critical conversation tends not to surface, but that is a genuine part of what makes the show work. There are also the sets themselves. The kill room, not any specific kill room, but the concept of the kill room, was built and rebuilt across the original series by the production design team as a modular element, reusable in different configurations and different locations. The aesthetic consistency of the kill rooms, the specific way the plastic sheeting drapes, the particular height of the table, the positioning of the examination light, is the result of a design team working with deliberate continuity across 8 seasons. The kill room is supposed to feel like the same room even when it is in a different building, a different garage, a different abandoned space. It almost always does. Season 1 of Dexter is one of the most accomplished first seasons in the history of prestige cable television. I am willing to say that fairly bluntly because I think it's true, and I think it doesn't get said enough in discussions that tend to jump straight to Season 4. The show arrives fully formed. The voice is there, the visual grammar is there, the central relationship between Dexter and Deborah is there, the Miami Metro dynamics are established, and the central mystery, who is the ice truck killer and what does he want, is sustained across 12 episodes with genuine skill. Here's what's happening on the surface of things. A new killer is operating in Miami. The crime scenes are distinctive to the point of being singular. Victims are drained completely of blood, dismembered and arranged with an almost artistic deliberateness. No mess, no apparent rage, no blood anywhere, which is, from a forensic perspective, both extraordinary and deeply strange. The investigations at Miami Metro are puzzled by the bloodlessness specifically. It suggests clinical facilities. It suggests someone with medical or forensic knowledge. It suggests, to Dexter's private fascination, someone who finds blood distressing, which Dexter himself does in a very specific way. He finds blood at crime scenes distressing, not because he objects to violence, but because blood specifically triggers something in him. A sensory aversion going back to the container. He is brilliant at his job precisely because he analyzes bloodstain patterns the way a person who finds a smell repulsive might become obsessive about cataloging it. Distance and expertise as a coping mechanism. And so he recognizes when he encounters these bloodless scenes that someone is communicating with him. The scenes are designed for his perception, arranged so that someone with his specific history and his specific aversion would understand them as messages. The killer is Brian Moser. This is the reveal the season builds toward, and it lands with real force, partly because the show has been genuinely careful not to make it too obvious too early. Brian operates under the alias Rudy Cooper, positions himself as a prosthetics manufacturer, which is where his clinical knowledge of cutting and reassembly comes from, and in one of the more quietly unsettling choices in the season begins dating Deborah Morgan. Deborah is the target, not the immediate target. Brian is not planning to kill Deborah first, but she is the final piece of a design that Brian has been working toward for a long time. He wants his brother back. He has tracked Dexter down across years. He knows exactly what Dexter is. The bloodless crime scenes are not just communication. They are courtship. Brian is showing Dexter what he can do, showing him that he is like him, showing him that he understands him in a way that no one else in Dexter's life can. And there is something genuinely compelling about this if you let yourself think about it from Brian's position. He was the boy Harry left behind. He was the one who remembered more, who was older, who experienced the full weight of what happened in that container without the cushioning of being 2 years old. He was institutionalized. He had nothing. He rebuilt himself from nothing into something extraordinarily capable and extraordinarily damaged. And the thing he wants most, after all of that, is his brother. When Dexter learns who the ice truck killer is, learns that Rudy is Brian, that Brian is his biological brother, that Harry knew and left him there, the episode that follows is one of the season's best. Dexter sits with this information. He visits Brian. They have genuine conversations, these two brothers who have never known each other, and there is a warmth between them that the show does not try to undermine. Brian is not performing this warmth. He actually loves Dexter in whatever way he is capable of love. He has spent years working toward this reunion. The finale of Season 1, Born Free, which holds an IMDb rating of 9.6, forces the choice that the whole season has been building toward. Brian kidnaps Deborah and positions her in an elaborate tableau in an abandoned hotel, wrists cut in the style of his kills, bleeding but not yet dead. The situation is constructed to force Dexter's hand. Brian has arranged things so that the only way Deborah survives is if Dexter chooses her. He is asking Dexter to declare himself, family of blood or family of choice. Dexter chooses Deborah. He saves her, and then he kills Brian, slits his throat, stages it as a suicide, and walks away from the one person on Earth who understood him without having to be taught what he was. I have always found this scene more affecting than it perhaps intends to be. The show presents it as a victory of a kind. Dexter has protected Deborah, has eliminated a killer who is becoming uncontrollable, has made the right choice according to the code. But what it actually is emotionally is Dexter killing the only person who truly knew him. He kills understanding itself. He kills the possibility of being known. And then he goes back to work the next morning. There is another dimension to the Season 1 story that is worth dwelling on. Harry's role in Brian Moser's life does not become fully clear until Season 2, but once you know it, it reframes everything about Season 1. Harry not only knew what happened to Brian, he monitored it. He visited the institution. He kept track of the boy he had abandoned, and at some point he apparently stopped. This information raises a question that the show wisely does not fully answer. Did Harry fear Brian specifically? Did he believe that Brian was beyond the code's reach, too damaged, too uncontrollable? Or was there something else, a guilt too large to act on, a decision too final to reverse? We don't know. The show gestures toward the complexity and then moves on, which is probably the right choice narratively, even if it leaves something unresolved. The Season 1 critical reception was solid, 83% on Rotten Tomatoes, and the show was named among the American Film Institute's 10 best television programs of 2006. The Emmy nomination for Outstanding Main Title Design that year was well-deserved. The opening credits sequence, the blood orange being sliced, the eggs crackling in the pan, the shirt button, the shoelace, became one of the most recognizable title sequences in prestige television. The deliberate mapping of ordinary domestic morning rituals onto imagery that suggests violence and precision is a very clean bit of visual communication about what Dexter Morgan does with his life. One more thing about Season 1 that I think deserves mention, and it's something that becomes more apparent on a rewatch. The show establishes very early the full scope of what Dexter is managing day to day. The performance of normalcy, the navigation of the department, the careful management of Deborah's well-being, the compartmentalization required to sit next to your colleagues and talk about a murder case that you know is yours. All of this is running simultaneously, continuously, with no breaks. Dexter describes it sometimes as exhausting and sometimes as second nature, and both of those things are simultaneously true. He is a person for whom the performance of being a person is a full-time job on top of his actual full-time job on top of his other full-time job. And yet the donuts on a Friday are always there, on time, the right kind for everyone. Season 2 begins almost immediately where Season 1 ends. The Brian Moser chapter is closed, Dexter has made his choice, and underneath the bay, the evidence of 17 years of choices is about to be discovered by a group of trainee divers who had the misfortune of picking that particular stretch of water for their lesson. Season 2 of Dexter has a 96% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. 96. That is an extraordinary number for a second season of anything, and it is deserved in ways that are worth unpacking. The season works so well because it does the thing that the best second seasons do. It takes everything established in year one and applies direct, sustained pressure to it. The premise cracks, the routine fails, the walls close in. The inciting event is as simple as it is catastrophic. A group of student divers on a certification exercise in Biscayne Bay surface from their dive having found something that stops everything. 38 garbage bags, human remains inside, years of material accumulated at Dexter's regular disposal site. Sitting on the ocean floor in what is now a documented, photographed crime scene. The tabloids name the unknown killer the Bay Harbor Butcher, and this name sticks, both within the fiction of the show and in the cultural memory of anyone who watched it. The FBI is called in, and Special Agent Frank Lundy, played with a wonderful low-key authority by Keith Carradine, arrives to lead the investigation. Lundy is competent in a way that Miami Metro often is not. He is methodical, focused, experienced with serial cases, and he brings genuine analytical rigor to the investigation. He is also, in a slightly unexpected subplot, falling in love with Deborah, who is working the case. Lundy is, in the context of the series, the best formal investigator who ever comes close to Dexter. He doesn't rely on instinct the way Dokes does, he follows procedure. And the evidence, if you follow it correctly, points in the right direction. And yet there is Dokes. James Dokes in Season 2 is a different kind of threat from Lundy, and I think it's worth being clear about why. Dokes does not have evidence, he has certainty. He has known for a long time that something is wrong with Dexter Morgan, and the discovery of the Bay Harbor Butcher's dump site is not a revelation to him. It is a confirmation. He begins following Dexter, surveilling him, documenting his movements. He eventually catches Dexter in the act of visiting a potential target and confronts him directly. The standoff that follows in an Everglades cabin is one of the most dramatically satisfying sequences in the season. Dokes has Dexter. He knows exactly what Dexter is. He has him trapped, and the code cannot help Dexter here because Dokes is not a murderer. He is a soldier who has done things in the field that exist in a moral gray area, but he is not a man Dexter can put on a table with a clear conscience. Eric King's performance in these scenes, the anger, the vindication, the fear, is something really special. Dokes has spent multiple years being the only person in a building full of detectives who understood that something was wrong with Dexter, and being dismissed and being treated as a problem himself. His hatred of Dexter is not irrational or petty. It is the frustrated fury of someone who was correct all along. The tragedy of Dokes is that he is right about everything and dies because of it. The mechanism of his death comes from outside the Dokes-Dexter conflict, which is part of what makes it so painful. Lila West enters the season as Dexter's court-mandated Narcotics Anonymous sponsor. Dexter has adopted a cover story as a drug addict to explain his suspicious behavior, and the NA chapter is where he is required to be. Lila, played by Jamie Murray, is one of the more genuinely unsettling characters in the early seasons, and not in the way the show seems to intend. She is introduced as an artist and a free spirit, and her aesthetic is almost aggressively extreme. The loft full of symbolic objects, the affected unpredictability, the intensity of her attention. She becomes obsessed with Dexter in the way that certain people become obsessed with damaged men they want to understand and possess. She is manipulative, dangerous, and in the end, useful to Dexter in a way that she should never have been. When Lila discovers what Dexter actually is, she does not recoil. She is, if anything, excited. This is the first version of what becomes a recurring dynamic in Dexter's life. A woman who discovers the truth and responds not with horror, but with a disturbing enthusiasm. The template is set here, and it is, as the show eventually makes clear, the wrong template. Lila burns down her own flat to manufacture a sympathy crisis. She frames Angel Batista for sexual assault by using Rohypnol she obtained from a drug dealer. She is, in other words, conducting her own campaign of manipulation alongside Dexter's, without the code and without any moral framework whatsoever. And then she discovers that Dokes is alive, imprisoned in the Everglades cabin, and she goes there and she blows it up. With Dokes inside, the death of James Dokes is staged as an explosion, clean, fast, not particularly graphically violent, and it is framed initially as a resolution. The Bay Harbor butcher investigation can now be closed. Dokes is posthumously convicted of the kills. Lundy wraps up the case. Dexter is safe. But the aftertaste of it is not resolution. The aftertaste is something more like shame, because Dokes was the right man. He was the honest cop. He was doing exactly what the law required, and he died for it, not directly at Dexter's hands, but as a consequence of Dexter's existence. Lila made the operational choice, but the conditions that made the choice possible were entirely Dexter's. Dexter then tracks Lila to Paris. She has fled to France and kills her there. He does not put her on a table. He does not take a blood slide. This kill is not code-sanctioned in the strict sense, though Lila is genuinely dangerous and has committed serious crimes. It is closer to self-preservation than justice. The distinction matters to the show, even if Dexter doesn't voice it directly. Season 2 also contains what is arguably the most devastating single piece of information in the entire original series, delivered in the quietest possible register. Tom Matthews tells Dexter the truth about Harry's death. They are sitting in Matthews' office. Dexter has been trying to make sense of something. The code, what it produced, why Harry never spoke about it in certain terms. And Matthews tells him, Harry didn't die of heart disease. He found Dexter one evening, walked in on him at work, saw the reality of what the code had created in practice, and could not bear it. He killed himself 3 days later. The official autopsy was buried. What follows is not a breakdown. Dexter doesn't weep or rage or visibly disintegrate. He processes, he goes quiet. He tries to locate himself in relation to this new fact. Harry built him, trained him, loved him, and then, when the theory of the code became visible as practice, couldn't live with what he had made. The hallucinatory Harry that Dexter has been speaking to throughout the series knows about this. In whatever sense, an internal projection can be said to know things. And the dynamic between them shifts after this revelation. Dexter looks at this hallucination of his father differently, speaks to him differently. There is a new layer of grief and complication in every subsequent interaction. Season 2 ends with a lot of things resolved on the surface and very little resolved underneath. Dokes is dead and officially blamed. Lila is dead. Lundy has closed the case and begun a relationship with Deborah. Rita and Dexter are on a tentative path toward reconciliation. From a certain angle, everything is fine, and yet the season's work is not containment, it is exposure. Season 2 is the season that shows Dexter how thin the line is between safety and catastrophe, how close it always is, how many things have to go right every time for the whole structure to hold. Season 3 shifts gear somewhat. It is quieter, less acutely pressurized. And it asks a different kind of question, not what happens when the investigation closes in, but what happens when someone extends their hand in friendship to the man who has been, for his entire adult life, completely alone. Season 3 is the season that tends to get a little lost when people discuss the arc of Dexter's quality. It sits between the sustained pressure of Season 2 and the devastating achievement of Season 4, and in the shadow of both of them, it can seem like a holding pattern. It isn't, quite. Season 3 is doing something specific and interesting. It is asking what happens when Dexter actually tries to be someone's friend. Not the perform version of friendship. Not the smile and nod social management that he does at Miami Metro every day. An actual friendship with someone who knows the truth about him, who sees him as he is, and who doesn't run. The problem, in the season is very clear that it is a problem, is what that person turns out to be. The season begins with an accident. Dexter's in the middle of a planned kill when Oscar Prado interrupts. Oscar has come to the location to buy drugs, and when he realizes what is happening, he pulls a knife. Dexter acts. Oscar dies, and Oscar's older brother, Miguel Prado, an assistant district attorney played with tremendous warmth and charisma by Jimmy Smits, becomes part of Dexter's life. The thing about Miguel Prado is that he is genuinely likable, not in a surface way, not as a calculated performance, but in the specific way of a person who is comfortable in his own skin and interested in the people around him. He is funny, he is charming, he has real convictions about justice, or at least he presents himself as having them. When he eventually discovers what Dexter is, his response is not revulsion, but curiosity and a kind of excited recognition. as though Dexter has confirmed something he had already suspected was possible. Miguel wants in. He wants to participate. He wants to use the code as he understands it to achieve what his legal career has not always been able to achieve: the removal of people he knows are guilty but can't convict. And for a while, this works, or seems to. Dexter and Miguel operate as something like partners, and there is a warmth in this that Dexter responds to in ways he doesn't fully understand at first. He has never had a friend who knew him. He has had Deborah, who loves him without knowing him. He has had Rita, who is beginning to know him but not in this dimension. He has had colleagues at work who like the performance. He has never had this, someone who sees the real thing and extends their hand anyway. The collapse of the friendship is about moral architecture, or rather about the absence of it in Miguel. Because Miguel Prado does not actually have the code. He has the code's permission, or so he believes, and he begins using that permission to pursue his own grievances rather than genuine justice. A political rival, a personal enemy. People he wants eliminated for reasons that have nothing to do with the vigilante framework. He is, in other words, a person who saw a useful tool and picked it up without understanding what the tool is actually for. When Dexter realizes this, when he sees that Miguel has killed an innocent person, or at least a person who does not meet the code's standards, the friendship is over in everything but the formality, and Dexter ends it in the only way available to him. He kills Miguel Prado. He puts him on the table, presents the evidence, performs the ritual, and feels grief. That is the detail that matters. He feels grief about this. The kill room, for the only time in the series, contains something like sadness rather than the satisfaction or resolution that usually accompanies it. I find this genuinely moving. Dexter is not performing grief for anyone's benefit. There is no audience in the kill room. He is sad because he lost something that he had only just realized he wanted, a friend who saw him. The fact that the friend turned out to be wrong for the role does not diminish the brief, specific reality of having been known. Season 3 also carries the pregnancy and eventual marriage of Dexter and Rita. Rita, played by Julie Benz, is carrying Dexter's biological child, Harrison, who will be born between seasons and whose existence will define the next phase of the show's mythology. Dexter proposes. Rita says yes. They have a wedding, a real one, with friends and a venue and dancing, a whole staging of the domestic life that Dexter has been performing for years as theater, but is now, in some sense, living for real. And Rita is wonderful. I want to say that plainly because the show sometimes treats her as a narrative prop, the domestic anchor who creates stakes for Dexter rather than a character with her own interior life. But Julie Benz brings so much genuine warmth and intelligence to the role that Rita consistently transcends her functional purpose. She is a woman who is in a genuinely abusive first marriage, who rebuilt herself with considerable effort, who fell in love with someone who is kind to her and patient with her children and steady in a way that her life has not previously offered. She deserves better than what Season 4 does to her. There is also, running alongside the Miguel story in Season 3, a secondary case involving a killer known as the Skinner, a torturer who operates in Miami and is connected to a criminal network that the Prado case is tangentially related to. The Skinner plotline is somewhat underserved compared to the Miguel arc, but it provides the season's procedural spine and its eventual finale confrontation. Dexter encounters the Skinner in the season finale in a rooftop fight that resolves fairly cleanly. Season 3 is a transitional season. It establishes the domestic architecture, the marriage, the pending child, the sense of a life being actually constructed rather than merely performed. That makes Season 4 so devastating. Without Season 3, the end of Season 4 doesn't land the same way. And I think that's the honest case for it. Not that it's great on its own terms, but that it does necessary work. And Season 4 is where we're going next. Season 4 is the one people point to when they want to argue about what prestige television can accomplish, the one with the season finale that holds a 9.8 on IMDb. The one that proves, beyond any reasonable argument, what this show was capable of at its best. Let me tell you about Arthur Mitchell. Let me start with the thing that makes Season 4 work before I start describing what happens in it. Because what makes it work is a deception. The season convinces you for longer than you'd expect that Arthur Mitchell has figured something out that Dexter hasn't. Arthur Mitchell, the Trinity killer, is played by John Lithgow. And John Lithgow is extraordinary in this role. Frightening not because he is performing monstrousness in any obvious way, but because he is performing ordinariness so convincingly that the monstrousness underneath is almost invisible until it very suddenly isn't. He is a school counselor, he is a church deacon, he volunteers for Habitat for Humanity, he has a wife, a daughter, a son, a house. He has been killing in a very specific, very structured pattern for approximately 30 years without being caught. The pattern itself is worth understanding because it is the most thematically integrated element of any villain's design in the show's run. Trinity kills in cycles of 4. Each kill in the cycle corresponds to a trauma from his own childhood. A suicide in a bathtub echoing his sister's death, a burial echoing his mother's, a bludgeoning echoing his father's, and a fourth, more recent kill type that represents a later phase of his violence. Each victim falls into a demographic connected to these memories. The kills are not random. They are an endlessly repeated attempt to process something that cannot be processed through repetition. Dexter understands the pattern before Miami Metro does. He finds Arthur Mitchell before Miami Metro does. And then he does something that, in retrospect, is completely understandable and also completely catastrophic. He doesn't kill him immediately. Dexter inserts himself into Arthur's life under the alias Kyle Butler, presenting himself as a stranger who admires the Habitat for Humanity work, who needs connection, who wants to learn something from this man. And what he wants to learn is this: Arthur Mitchell has a family, a real family, a wife who has been with him for decades, children, a home life. And Arthur has managed, through some mechanism Dexter cannot identify, to maintain all of this alongside 30 years of active killing. How? How has he done it? Because Dexter is a new father, Harrison has been born, he has a wife, he has a stepchildren. He is trying to work out how to be all the things he is simultaneously: the husband, the father, the forensics analyst, the Bay Harbor butcher, without any of the structures collapsing. And Arthur Mitchell looks, from the outside, like someone who solved that problem. The dismantling of this idea takes most of the season, and it is done with enormous care, because the reality of Arthur Mitchell's family life is not the solution Dexter imagined. It is a horror show. Arthur's wife Sally is afraid of him in the quiet, chronic way of someone who has been afraid for so long that she has forgotten what it was like not to be. His daughter Rebecca has the brittle brightness of a person who has learned to perform happiness to prevent something worse. His son Jonah is already damaged in ways that will take years to fully emerge. The family is a hostage situation wearing the clothes of domesticity. And this is the season's central argument, stated in the most visceral possible terms. There is no model. Arthur Mitchell is not the answer. The double life does not become sustainable through practice or discipline or the right circumstances. It devours everything around it slowly and completely. And what's left standing at the end is not a family, but the architecture of one, hollowed out. Dexter doesn't see this quickly enough. He keeps engaging with Arthur, partly because he still believes there is something to learn, partly because the investigation is ongoing, partly because the specific texture of what is wrong with the Mitchell household takes time to perceive. And in that time, Arthur sees Dexter, or rather, Arthur sees Kyle Butler. And Kyle Butler has made certain errors in cover that Arthur is piecing together with the quiet intelligence of a man who has successfully hidden his own second life for 3 decades. By the time Dexter understands the full picture, that there is no solution here, that Arthur is not a teacher but a cautionary tale, that the only thing to do is what he should have done months earlier. The season is in its final stretch, and a number of things have happened that cannot be undone. The Season 4 finale, The Getaway, is the episode that most Dexter fans will tell you represents the show at its absolute height. It carries an IMDb user rating of 9.8, which is exceptional for any dramatic episode of television. And the directing Emmy that Steve Schill received for it is thoroughly earned. The finale reaches its first resolution in a parking garage. Dexter has Arthur at last. He injects him. He loads him into the back of a vehicle. It is over, or it should be. The code is about to be satisfied. Arthur Mitchell, 30 years of murder, is about to meet the only end the code permits. And then Dexter gets a voicemail from Rita. She has gone back to the house, she says. She forgot something. Her voice is completely ordinary. There is nothing in it that signals anything wrong. Dexter goes to the house. The door's unlocked. There is silence from inside. He moves through the rooms, and then he reaches the bathroom and he stops. Rita is in the bathtub. She is dead. She's been killed in the precise manner of the first kill in the Trinity cycle. The bathtub, the wrist, the specific staging. Arthur Mitchell, in the last hours before Dexter caught him, completed his cycle one final time. And on the bathroom floor, sitting in a pool of his mother's blood, is Harrison, the infant, crying. It is a direct, precise mirror of Dexter's own origin. Harrison in the blood, surrounded by what violence has produced, waiting to be found. The cycle has reproduced itself. Dexter's worst fear, that what is in him might be passed on, that his existence generates rather than prevents harm to the people near him, has manifested in the most literal possible form. The restraint of the final sequence is what makes it work so completely. There is no score for a stretch of it, just the sound of Harrison crying and Dexter's breathing. Michael C. Hall does very little. He kneels, he picks up his son, he sits there. The absence of dramatic gesture is the right choice because what has happened is too large for dramatic gesture. I want to mention something about the production of Season 4 that adds a layer to everything. During filming, Michael C. Hall was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. He underwent treatment while continuing production, chemotherapy and the rest of it, and the makeup and wardrobe departments worked around the physical changes this produced. He publicly disclosed the diagnosis in January 2010, just after receiving the Golden Globe for this season's performance, which he accepted wearing a skull cap that was already a kind of quiet statement. He won the Golden Globe, the SAG Award, and the Emmy nomination for Best Lead Actor for a season he filmed while actively being treated for cancer. The Golden Globe win specifically was paired with John Lithgow's win for Best Supporting Actor, both for the same season of the same show. It remains one of the more remarkable collective achievements in the show's awards history. Lithgow's Emmy win for Outstanding Guest Actor for his portrayal of Arthur Mitchell is equally well-deserved. The performance is extraordinary in its specificity. The particular register of warmth and threat that Lithgow maintains simultaneously, the way Arthur's public self is so perfectly calibrated that you can understand exactly why no one suspected him, and the way the private self bleeds through in moments so small that they're almost invisible until you know what you're looking for. Season 4 achieves a Rotten Tomatoes score of 88%, and the show was nominated for Outstanding Drama Series at the Emmys for the fourth consecutive time, a record as Showtime's first ever drama to receive the nomination. The Directing Emmy for The Getaway is, to date, the only writing or directing Emmy the show ever won for a specific episode outside its technical categories. Season 4 ends where it begins, more or less, with a man kneeling in blood waiting to be found. But the nature of what comes next is completely different because Dexter at 2 years old was found by Harry, who had a plan. Dexter, at whatever age he is at the end of Season 4, is alone with an infant, and a plan that has just been comprehensively destroyed. What follows is a season about grief, and about what you do with someone who has survived something terrible because of you. After the Season 4 finale, the show is in a genuinely difficult position. The question isn't just what comes next in the story, and it's what register comes next. Do you go darker? Do you pull back? Do you give the audience breathing room or press the wound? Season 5's answer, and I think it's the right one, is to go quieter, not simpler. The case this season is complex and the emotional territory is difficult, but lower in register, more internal, less acutely pressurized. It is a season about aftermath and about what you do when someone hands you their grief alongside their partnership. The premiere episode, My Bad, begins with Dexter still in the house. Police have been called, officers are moving around him. And his first response to Rita's death is not the one that people around him expect, not the visible collapse or the immediate grief, but a kind of suspended processing. He waits for the officers to arrive, he talks to them, he organizes, he manages the situation with the precision that he applies to everything. And then, alone later, the show does something genuinely interesting. Instead of a conventional grief scene, we get Dexter trying, with increasing frustration, to locate what grief is supposed to feel like. He knows it is supposed to be present, he cannot access it in the expected form. He knows that what happened to Rita is because of him, not directly but causally, in the way that everything in Dexter's life ultimately traces back to the same source. And the guilt is large and clear and comprehensible in a way that the grief itself is not. Aster and Cody, Rita's children from her first marriage, who have been Dexter's stepchildren for a season and a half, grieve in the normal, visible, legible way. And watching them, Dexter has a reference point that he cannot inhabit. Julia Stiles arrives as Lumen Pierce midway through the season, and she is the character who makes Season 5 work. Lumen is a survivor. She was one of several women kidnapped by a group of connected, powerful men who operated as a predatory collective for years. The Barrel Girls case, as it comes to be called within the show. The men in the group used a network of private spaces to imprison, assault, and kill women. Some of the victims were found, some were not. Lumen survived. When Dexter finds her, she has already witnessed him kill one of her captors. The expected response in the show's narrative grammar would be horror. A potential witness, a problem to be managed, but Lumen doesn't behave the expected way. She doesn't turn him in. She is already in the middle of trying to do what Dexter does without his training or his tools. She wants the men who did this to her to be dead. She wants to do it herself. And she asks for his help. The partnership that develops between them is one of the most interesting relationships in the entire series. And I think it holds up better on a rewatch than its initial reputation suggests. Because what Lumen represents, the dark passenger as a conditional state, something that can be created by circumstance and then, when the circumstances resolve, released, is a genuine complication of everything the show has been saying about Dexter's nature up to this point. Lumen has a dark passenger. It is specific and named and urgent. She needs these men to be dead. She cannot rest until they are. This need is real, not performed, not rationalized. It is the response of a specific person to a specific set of events, and it is completely comprehensible. And when the last of them is dead, the passenger is gone. Lumen tells Dexter this. She is done. It's over. She doesn't want to stay in Miami, doesn't want to continue, doesn't want whatever the next stage of this would be. She is going back to her life. The departure is quiet. She goes. And Dexter, who has grown genuinely close to her in a way that is different from anything that came before, who has in some sense been more honestly himself with Lumen than with anyone since Brian Moser, watches her leave and returns to his life alone. The question Lumen's arc raises is one that sits unresolved in the show's mythology for the rest of the run. If the dark passenger can be a response to experience rather than an innate condition, what does that mean for Dexter's version of it? He has always presented his need as something permanent and unchosen. Lumen's capacity to be done suggests at least the possibility that choice is involved somewhere, that the architecture is not necessarily fixed. The show doesn't answer this, and I think that's intentional. The antagonists this season, Jordan Chase and the group of men he leads, are functional without being particularly memorable in comparison to what the show has managed in previous years. Jordan Chase, played by Johnny Lee Miller, is a motivational speaker who fronts the predatory group, and the character is constructed to be as cleanly despicable as possible. The motivation for the kills is clear, the evidence Dexter accumulates is clear, the path through the season is clear. But there is one moment in the season that transcends the main case entirely and deserves more attention than it generally gets. Near the end of the season, Deborah is closing in on the vigilantes responsible for the kills. The Barrel Girls' killers, as it were. And she enters a space where Dexter and Lumen are still inside, plastic sheeting up, kill room in evidence. She cannot see their faces. She does not know who they are, and she lets them go. She makes a judgment call. She can feel that this is not random violence. She can read the crime scene well enough. She is a very good detective, whatever Miami Metro's overall batting average might suggest, to understand that whoever is in that room has done something. She disagrees with the method, but cannot entirely disagree with the motive. She lets them walk. This moment becomes enormous in retrospect. Deborah comes very close to discovering Dexter's secret 3 full seasons before she does, and she chooses not to look more closely. Whether she sensed something she wasn't ready to name, whether some part of her protective sibling instinct was already at work, is left characteristically unresolved. Season 5 ends with a somewhat unusual epilogue. Dexter, now a single father, managing Harrison and the remnants of his domestic life, minus a wife and partner. Astor and Cody have gone to live with Rita's parents. Harrison is present. The Morgan house, which is the Bennett's house really, is gone from the equation. What's interesting about where Season 5 leaves things is that it strips the domestic architecture back to almost nothing and then asks what Dexter is without it. Not the husband, not the stepfather, not the organized suburban front, just the man and the child and the code. What that looks like going forward is one of the more quietly running threads in the later episodes, and that brings us finally to the church. But to get there, we have to go through Season 6 first, which has its problems, as we'll discuss, but also has something I want to spend a little time with before I talk about what's wrong with it. Season 6 is the most visually ambitious season of the original run and also the most critically divisive. The crimes being investigated are genuinely striking. Ritualistic murders staged as tableau from the Book of Revelation, elaborate and meticulous in a way that suggests both genuine religious obsession and considerable production design budget. The Doomsday Killer, as Miami Metro labels the unknown perpetrator, is creating scenes that are genuinely arresting to look at. The problem, and it is a real problem, is the twist. The season introduces two apparent antagonists. Travis Marshall is a former student of religious studies played by Colin Hanks, earnest and conflicted and visibly troubled by what he is participating in. Professor James Geller is his mentor, played by Edward James Olmos, a theologian who has gone off the rails into apocalyptic violence. The two of them appear to operate as a team throughout most of the season. We see them together, we see them plan, we see their dynamic, Geller as the driving force, Travis as the reluctant instrument. And then the season reveals, fairly late, that Geller has been dead for years. Travis has been hallucinating him. The Doomsday tableaux have been the work of Travis alone, with Geller existing only as an internal projection, a rationalization, and a driving voice. To be fair, this is not a bad idea in principle. The parallel to Dexter's own hallucinated Harry is clear and intentional. This is the season that was supposed to explore questions of religion and conscience and the voices we use to authorize our own behavior. Travis externalizes his darkest impulses onto the image of his mentor, just as Dexter externalizes his onto the image of his father. The thematic logic is coherent. The execution is where it falls apart somewhat, and I say this as someone who genuinely enjoys revisiting this season despite its reputation. The issue is not that the twist is implausible. It is that the show plays the scenes involving Geller too literally. Physical interactions that, on a rewatch, require you to retroactively reinterpret as entirely Travis's hallucination, and not all of them survive that reinterpretation convincingly. In any real crime drama, the forensic implications of a single perpetrator versus a two-person team would be examined much more closely. The show's willingness to paper over this with narrative momentum is somewhat characteristic of the later seasons. The 38% Rotten Tomatoes score for Season 6 is the show's lowest to this point, and it reflects genuine critical ambivalence rather than simple dismissal. The season is trying to do things. Several of the Dexter and Harrison scenes this season are genuinely affecting. Deborah's promotion arc is strong. Masuka's subplot involving his long-lost daughter, introduced here, is an interesting, if eventually underused addition to the ensemble. And then the finale arrives, and it redeems a great deal. Dexter tracks Travis Marshall to a church. He finds him there. He does what the code requires. He is in the middle of the kill, the plastic, the table, the ritual, when the church doors open and Deborah walks in. She sees him. With the body, with the knife, in the church. Jennifer Carpenter's performance in this moment is exactly right, and I want to be specific about why. She does not scream, she does not immediately reach for a weapon or a phone. She stands there, and the expression she produces is one of the most difficult emotions to convey convincingly on screen. Not horror, not rage, not shock in the sharp sense, but a kind of complete, wordless, cognitive collapse. The frame of reference she has used to understand her brother for her entire life has just ceased to function. Whatever she is looking at, she has no language for it yet. The season ends on that image. The church, the tableau, her face, cut to black. Season 7 begins immediately after and sustains a level of dramatic quality that I would place very close to Season 4. The Deborah Knows storyline is what elevates it, because the best thing Season 7 does is refuse to give Deborah a clean response. She doesn't report Dexter, she doesn't simply accept him. She cycles through rejection and attempted intervention and grief and anger and a peculiar, distorted kind of loyalty. The loyalty of someone who loves a person whose nature they cannot reconcile with what love is supposed to mean. Jennifer Carpenter and Michael C. Hall's work together this season is as good as anything in the original series. The scenes between Deborah and Dexter now carry a specific, compacted weight. Every interaction is loaded with what she knows and what she is choosing to do with knowing it. She tries to get him to stop. She tries to get him to check in with her before each kill. She establishes a kind of oversight arrangement that makes her effectively complicit, which is the show's point. The moment you know and choose not to act, you have crossed a line, and the show is interested in what that crossing does to a person. Hannah McKay arrives this season, and I want to give her proper credit because she is a genuinely interesting character in a show that does not always serve its female characters as well as it might. Hannah, played by Yvonne Strahovski, is a former accomplice to a serial killer who has since quietly managed her own killings. Poisoning, mostly targeted and deliberate, rooted in self-protection, and occasionally something harder to categorize. What makes her interesting as a character is her utter lack of drama about what she is. She does not have a dark passenger. She does not have a code. She does not have Harry's ghost or Vogel's framework or the need to externalize her nature onto anything outside herself. She simply is what she is, and she has made her peace with it. When Dexter puts her on the table and then doesn't kill her, which is, for this show, an extraordinary deviation, it is because he has encountered something genuinely unfamiliar, a version of the thing he is that seems to carry no particular burden. Their relationship is the most honest Dexter has in the original series. He does not have to perform with Hannah. He does not have to manage her perception of him. She knows. She is comfortable with knowing. There is a relief in this that the show communicates clearly, and that relief makes Dexter's later efforts to protect Hannah from Deborah, from legal jeopardy, from the various complications the season throws at her, feel genuinely motivated rather than just narratively convenient. The season's ostensible villain is Isaac Serko, a high-ranking figure in the Ukrainian Koshka Brotherhood crime syndicate, played by Ray Stevenson. What's interesting about Isaac is that he is introduced as a threat and gradually becomes something closer to a peer, a character whose intelligence and self-possession Dexter recognizes, whose reasons for wanting Dexter dead turn out to be rooted in grief rather than business, and who develops, over the course of their interactions, a strange mutual respect with the man he is trying to kill. Their conversations are some of the season's best material. Isaac is ultimately killed by a rival faction, not by Dexter, a narrative choice that reflects the show's increasingly complicated relationship with the code's supposed moral clarity. And then there is La Guerta. Maria La Guerta reopens the Bay Harbor butcher case in Season 7, triggered by the discovery of a bloodslide at a crime scene. She forms a theory early and pursues it with the methodical patience of someone who has been waiting for a thread to pull. She suspects Dexter from the beginning, or very nearly the beginning, and she is right, and the investigation she runs this season is the most competent police work the show presents from a named character over the entire original run. LaGuardia is not easily deflected. She is not fooled by false evidence. She anticipates what Dexter will do and positions herself accordingly. She is, in the context of the show's universe, doing exactly what should have been done years earlier. And in the season finale, with the evidence assembled and the arrest imminent, Deborah shoots her. This is the moral event horizon of the series. Everything before this, Dexter's kills, Deborah's knowledge, the accumulated complicity, could theoretically be walked back from. This cannot. Deborah has killed a colleague, a supervisor, an innocent woman to protect her brother. She crossed the line that the code was supposedly designed to prevent Dexter from crossing, and she crossed it not in service of justice, but in service of family. Lagerta dies, and Deborah, who spent the entire series as the show's moral center, the person who genuinely tried to do the right thing even when it was hard, is no longer that. Whatever Deborah is after this moment, she is not the moral center. Season 7's Rotten Tomatoes score of 79% is a genuine recovery from Season 6, and it reflects the real energy this storyline generates. The Deborah-Dexter relationship, deepened by knowledge and fractured by complicity, is the show finding its best register again. Season 8 is where we go next, and it is, I'll be honest about this from the start, the most difficult season to discuss with affection. Not because it lacks interesting ideas, it has several, but because the execution of those ideas, and the finale in particular, falls short of what the show earned in the years before it. Let me talk about Dr. Vogel, and then let me talk about what the ending tries to be and what it actually is. Here is the honest thing to say about Season 8 before we get into any of it. The season has ideas that deserve a better execution than they received, and the finale has an ending that deserved a better season to arrive at. These are two separate complaints, and both of them are valid. I say this not to write the season off, we're not here to pile on, but because it matters for how to watch what Season 8 is attempting, which is considerably more interesting than its reputation allows. That reputation is not unearned. The finale holds an IMDb rating in the 4.6 range. The season has a 35% Rotten Tomatoes score. These are genuinely low numbers for any series. Dr. Evelyn Vogel arrives in Miami in the season premiere, and Charlotte Rampling plays her with exactly the right combination of warmth and calculation. Vogel is a neuropsychiatrist who specializes in psychopathy, and she has come to find Dexter because she is connected to him in a way he doesn't initially understand. As the season establishes, Vogel worked with Harry Morgan in the early days of the Code. Harry sought her out because he didn't know how to manage what he saw in young Dexter, and she helped him design the framework. She is, in a meaningful sense, Dexter's second creator. This revelation, which comes reasonably early in the season and is developed with some care, genuinely enriches the mythology. If the Code is not purely Harry's improvised parenting, but a framework designed by a professional who had studied psychopathy extensively, then its contours shift slightly. It is less personal and more clinical, less a father's love and more an experiment. Vogel describes people like Dexter with a word she clearly finds neutral and accurate: necessary. She believes psychopaths like Dexter serve a social function, that the predator of predators has a place in the ecosystem. This is an interesting position for a character to hold, and Rampling plays it without tipping into obvious villainy. Vogel is not simply a manipulator, she genuinely believes what she says. She has a clinical affection for Dexter that is real in its way, even if it is also possessive and proprietary in ways that are not entirely comfortable. The season's central threat is the brain surgeon, a killer who is removing portions of victims' brains and leaving them as trophies. The investigation leads eventually to Daniel Vogel, Evelyn's son, whom she had institutionalized years earlier for violent behavior. He has come back not as the man his mother remembers, but as something the years have reshaped into something genuinely dangerous. Daniel Vogel kills Evelyn late in the season. Charlotte Rampling's exit from the show is handled with a kind of quiet gravity that suits the character. A person whose composure was always her armor, finding that armor inadequate at the last. The loss of Vogel removes the only living link between the Code and its origins, and this matters more than the season quite has time to excavate. Alongside all of this, the season has been building toward what seems like the closest thing to a hopeful ending the show has ever offered. Dexter, Hannah McKay, who has returned to the picture, and Harrison are going to flee to Argentina together. They will start over. They will be a family, a strange one, but a functional one, built on honesty rather than performance. This is presented with enough seriousness that you allow yourself to believe it might happen. And then Deborah is shot. A gunshot wound followed by a stroke during surgery, a complication, a failure at the wrong moment, the body doing what it sometimes does. Deborah survives the initial surgery but does not recover. She is on life support. The brain has been deprived of oxygen long enough that what returns will not be Deborah in any meaningful sense. Dexter disconnects her from the machines. Jennifer Carpenter's final scenes in the series are characteristically underplayed and very affecting. Deborah has been, in many ways, the show's actual central character. The person through whom we measure Dexter's impact on the world. The person whose moral deterioration represents the most visible cost of what Dexter is. Her death is not dramatic, it is quiet and clinical and final, which is exactly the right choice. And then comes the finale. Remember the monsters? The title alone is interesting. It is Harrison's phrase, a fragment of something Dexter once said to him. And the episode is trying to be a meditation on what Dexter has left behind in the world and what he should do about it. What happens is this. With Deborah gone and a hurricane approaching Miami, Dexter drives his boat, the slice of life, the vessel of 17 years of kills, into the storm. The implication is that he has been lost at sea. He is presumed dead. The boat is destroyed. The investigation into Dexter Morgan, which was building significant momentum in the final episode, simply stops. And then the final scene. Oregon or some remote northern state. The exact location is ambiguous. A bearded man in a lumberyard. He turns around and it is Dexter, alive and silent and apparently completely alone in the world, existing in a kind of willed isolation. The lumberjack epilogue, as it came to be known, is probably the most parodied and mocked image in the franchise's history. And I want to be fair about what it is trying to do because it is trying to do something. The argument is, Dexter has accepted that his existence destroys the people around him. Everyone he loves is dead or gone. The only moral response, the only version of the code applied to himself, is to remove himself entirely from the world, to exile the predator so that the ecosystem around him can recover. This is not an incoherent idea. It tracks thematically. The problem is that it doesn't feel earned by the season that precedes it because Season 8's emotional logic is not consistently tight enough to build to this conclusion with the weight it requires. The brain surgeon storyline, while structurally competent, does not generate the same pressure as the best seasons. The Argentina plan raises and then deflates hope in a compressed time frame. And the finale itself moves quickly through grief that the show hasn't quite given itself time to develop fully. In any fair assessment of the finale, though, the creative team deserves some credit for refusing to let Dexter simply win. He does not get Argentina. He does not get Hannah and Harrison. He gets nothing. A snowbound exile, alone, separated from the son he failed and the life he destroyed. There is a punitive bleakness to this that is, in principle, the right register for the character's ending. The IMDb rating for the finale sits at 4.6, which is genuinely very low for any episode of a major series. Showtime was later candid about the fact that the ending was always intended to leave room for continuation. And the trajectory of the franchise since 2013, from New Blood through to Resurrection, confirms that the lumberjack in the snow was never meant to be the definitive image of Dexter Morgan. It was a placeholder. It just happened to be a placeholder that felt, to a great many viewers, like an ending they weren't satisfied with. The corrective came 8 years later. And it was, against most reasonable expectations, very good. New Blood arrives in November 2021, which means there are 8 years of accumulated frustration between the lumberjack and whatever this is. 8 years of fans arguing about what went wrong, 8 years of the franchise being defined by an ending that didn't satisfy rather than the 70-something episodes that preceded it. That's a long time for a story to be in that particular limbo. Clyde Phillips came back. This matters enormously. Phillips was the showrunner for the show's golden period, seasons 1 through 4. And his departure after season 4 correlates almost exactly with the critical decline that followed. His return for New Blood was, from the first announcement, a signal that this was a genuine attempt at something rather than a cash-in. The decision to set New Blood in a small upstate New York town rather than Miami is interesting and I think entirely correct. Iron Lake is the fictional location. The actual filming took place in Shelburne Falls, Massachusetts, a village in Franklin County, which is exactly the kind of small, specific, photographically interesting New England town that serves as Iron Lake. The visual contrast with the original series is immediate and deliberate. Where Miami was hot, bright, saturated, oceanic, Iron Lake is cold, white, enclosed, landlocked. The change in setting signals a change in what kind of story this is. Dexter has been living here for approximately 10 years, as Jim Lindsay, a name that is itself a small gift for anyone paying attention, since Jeff Lindsay wrote the original novels. He sells sporting goods. He is in a relationship with Angela Bishop, the local police chief. He attends community events. He is, by every visible metric, a person who has achieved what Harry's code was designed to prevent: complete submersion in ordinary life, the dark passenger apparently gone silent. The white deer is the show's first symbolic gesture. A rare white buck has been living in the woods near town, and Dexter has a relationship with it. Not a sentimental one exactly, but the kind of relationship that forms between a person who goes into the woods regularly and a creature that has stopped fearing them. He watches it. He does not hunt it. When a wealthy developer named Matt Caldwell kills the deer in an illegal hunt, and Dexter witnesses this, the first kill in a decade follows with a kind of inevitability that the show stages carefully. The white deer's death is Dexter's return. Cause and effect. The dormant thing awakens. Matt Caldwell is the son of Kurt Caldwell, the wealthiest and most powerful figure in Iron Lake, played by Clancy Brown, who is magnificent in the role. Kurt is a self-made man, a truck stop baron, the kind of person who has been Iron Lake's unofficial mayor for decades, who is beloved in the way that powerful people in small communities are beloved when there is no other large economic presence to compete with. He is also a serial killer who has been operating for approximately 25 years, luring young women passing through his truck stops into a situation from which they do not escape. Kurt's kills are stored in an underground bunker beneath his cabin, a trophy room where the preserved bodies of his victims have been arranged. This is the show's most direct and explicit statement of the mirror relationship between Dexter and his primary antagonist. Kurt and Dexter are the same thing, in the same geography, at the same time. Both are community members, both are trusted figures, both have secret lives that would destroy everything about their public identity if known. The difference the show insists on is the one that has always been at the center of the code. Dexter targets the guilty, Kurt targets the innocent. This distinction is real, but new blood is also sharp enough to notice that from the outside looking in, the distinction would not necessarily be legible. Dexter and Kurt are the same size of secret. Harrison Morgan arrives mid-season, and his arrival is the heart of everything. Jack Alcott plays him as a teenager who has been shaped by absence, not absence of love necessarily, but absence of a specific person. He grew up knowing that his mother was murdered, that his father faked his own death, that the letter Dexter wrote to Hannah about dark tendencies was real and was about him. He has spent years in foster care and at the edges of the people his father left behind. He has come to Iron Lake looking for answers, not for his father exactly, or not only, but for the thing his father represents. The thing that might be in him, his own possible dark passenger, and whether it is actually there. The early scenes between Dexter and Harrison are some of the best material in the entire franchise. Not because they are warm, they are not initially, but because the specific emotional truth of a father and a son who are strangers, meeting in the wreckage of the father's choices, is rendered with more honesty than the original series' family dynamics often managed. Harrison is not naive. He has thought about this for a long time. He has things he needs to know, and he is not going to accept a performance. Their dynamic evolves across the season into something that begins to function like genuine partnership, Dexter involving Harrison in aspects of his world, Harrison demonstrating aptitudes that mirror his father's in ways that are simultaneously thrilling and troubling to both of them. And the show is careful throughout to keep the question of Harrison's nature open. He has violent impulses. He has arrived at several situations with a capacity for physical confrontation that goes beyond normal. Whether this is the dark passenger in hereditary form or something that was created by the particular chaos of his upbringing is never definitively answered. Angela Bishop is a superb character for the season to build around. She is methodical and instinctive in equal measure. She has been quietly investigating the disappearances of young women near the truck routes through Iron Lake for years. Cases that were not given proper attention by state or federal agencies because the victims were marginal, because the geography was inconvenient, because no one with sufficient institutional authority cared. She cares. This makes her, in the context of the season, simultaneously the investigator who finds Kurt Caldwell and the investigator who finds Dexter Morgan. The moment she calls Angel Batista in Miami, discovering that Jim Lindsay is Dexter Morgan, that Dexter Morgan is not dead, that Angel is still working and still connected to what happened in Miami, is one of the season's most satisfying dramatic beats. Batista arrives. He brings files, he brings the institutional memory of the Bay Harbor butcher case, and he also brings, quietly, the knowledge of what happened to Maria Laguerta. The season builds across 10 episodes toward a confrontation that everyone can see coming. The Code will be satisfied with respect to Kurt Caldwell, and then the matter of Dexter's own exposure will need to be resolved. What New Blood does, very specifically, is refuse to resolve this through any of the conventional exits the original series used. Dexter cannot run. He cannot frame someone else. He cannot disappear again. What actually happens is this: Dexter breaks out of jail, where he has been held on legitimate evidence, and kills Logan, the deputy, in the process of escape. Logan is innocent. Logan is simply a cop doing his job. And this is where the season's moral argument reaches its conclusion. The survival instinct, which has always been the part of Dexter that the Code cannot fully contain, consumes an innocent man. The thing Harry built to prevent this exact outcome has failed, because the premise of the Code, that it could channel and contain the damage, was always partially aspirational. Harrison finds Dexter at the clearing where they were supposed to meet. He knows what has happened. He knows about Logan. And he asks his father, quietly, without theatrical fury, whether his mother would be alive if it weren't for Dexter, whether Deborah would be, whether any of the people who were destroyed in proximity to his father's life might have lived differently. Dexter tells him to take the safety off the rifle. He means it. He looks at his son and he tells him to shoot. Harrison shoots his father. With his last breath, Dexter tells Harrison that he did good, and this is, despite everything, despite the logic of what just happened, an affecting moment, because it is Dexter at the end choosing to die rather than abandon his son again. He could have run. He chose not to. The Code, in its most final form, was applied to himself. Angela arrives. She sees Harrison standing over Dexter's body. She makes a choice, the same kind of choice that characters in this universe have been making for years, the judgment call that falls outside the formal rules. And she tells Harrison to go. She gives him cash. She tells him to leave and never come back. Harrison drives out of Iron Lake past Audrey's house. He doesn't stop. He keeps going. New Blood became the most watched series in Showtime's history, averaging around 8 million viewers per week across all platforms. A remarkable achievement for a sequel to a show that had been off the air for 8 years. The finale alone drew 3 million viewers. By almost any commercial and critical metric, the revival was a success. It did what it was supposed to do. It closed the loop on Dexter Morgan in a way that felt earned and final. And then, of course, the franchise opened the next chapter, because Dexter survived. Before we talk about Resurrection and where the franchise is going, let me go backward, because Original Sin takes us to 1991. A year before any of the events of the original series, before the Bay Harbor Butcher, before Brian Moser, or Rita, or Miguel Prado, or any of it. This is the prequel. Original Sin premiered in December 2024 on Paramount Plus with Showtime, and ran 10 episodes through to February 2025. The premise is straightforward. This is young Dexter, in his early 20s, transitioning from a forensic science student to a full-time intern at Miami Metro, and beginning under Harry's active guidance to make his first structured kills. It is the story of how the Code becomes operational. The casting challenge is enormous. Patrick Gibson plays young Dexter, and this is, let's be clear, one of the more difficult assignments in recent television casting. Michael C. Hall's version of the character is one of the most precisely defined performances in prestige television. The posture, the cadence, the specific texture of the voice, the way the smile works. Gibson cannot simply imitate this. He has to find the younger version of the person who becomes that character, which means he has to find the earlier iteration before all of it was fully formed. By most accounts, Gibson acquits himself reasonably well. He captures the analytical stillness, the slight displacement from normal social rhythms, the sense of someone performing participation in human interactions they find somewhat opaque. What he naturally cannot provide is 30 years of Michael C. Hall's accumulated authority in the role, and Original Sin lives with that limitation throughout its run. Christian Slater as Harry is, to my mind, the more interesting casting choice and the one that pays off more fully. Slater brings something unexpected to the role, a warmth that has edges in it, a man who genuinely loves his son and is also genuinely managing him, making decisions about him that he frames as parenting, but that are also unmistakably a kind of design process. This Harry is not the mythologized figure that the original series flashbacks sometimes produced. He is a middle-aged police officer who is improvising in real time, second-guessing himself, trying to make something work in the absence of any precedent for what he is dealing with. The relationship between this Harry and this Dexter, still developing, still finding its terms, is the prequel's richest material. The code is being written. The rules are being articulated for the first time. When Harry says, "never get caught," or "only the guilty," these are not yet the fixed axioms of the adult Dexter's life. They are new constructs, being tested against fresh circumstances shaped by each situation they encounter. Molly Brown plays young Deborah, and she is working in the shadow of Jennifer Carpenter's performance in the same way that Gibson is working in the shadow of Hall. The early Deborah, before the career arc, before the Lagerta relationship, before the church, is still forming. She is just beginning the police academy. She is, in terms of the character's full trajectory, near the beginning of everything. The most structurally interesting element of Original Sin is Michael C. Hall's voiceover. The show uses adult Dexter, Hall's actual voice, Hall's actual cadence, as a framing device, narrating the events of 1991 from some unspecified future vantage point. This is a smart choice because it provides continuity across the performance gap. We hear the Dexter we know reflecting on who he was. It also means that Original Sin exists in a strange temporal space. We are watching the beginning of the story as narrated by someone who knows how it ends. The show's first documented kills, Nurse Mary and Tony Ferrer, are handled with a deliberateness that suits the prequel's interest in the mechanics of how the process was established. Nurse Mary is the first. The kill room is not yet the polished ritual of the original series. It is rougher, more tentative, shaped in real time. Harry is present in an advisory capacity. The code is being used for the first time as a guide to an actual situation rather than a theory. Sarah Michelle Gellar appears as Tanya Martin, the chief of forensics at Miami Metro, a casting choice that works quite well and that Gellar seems to enjoy. There is something in the show's use of familiar faces from other television contexts that feels warm and slightly self-aware. Now, there is something that has to be acknowledged about Original Sin, which is that it was canceled. A second season had been officially announced, and then, in August 2025, quietly reversed. The specific reasons have not been fully disclosed by Paramount Plus, though the show's mixed critical reception, a Metascore of 50/100 and a Rotten Tomatoes score reflecting genuine critical ambivalence, likely played some role. The premiere drew 2.1 million viewers, which was a streaming record for Showtime at the time, so the commercial case was not obviously weak. What is genuinely unfortunate about the cancellation is not so much the loss of any particular storyline. Prequel series have an inherent structural limitation in that we know where they are going, but the loss of what the second season might have developed in terms of character. The Harry of Original Sin was being built into something interesting. The young Deborah had room to grow, and the question of how the code moved from improvised framework to established doctrine across specific situations and specific choices was one that Original Sin was beginning to answer in ways that the original series flashbacks could only gesture toward. To be fair to the show, and I think fairness is the right register here, Original Sin was operating under constraints that no prequel series entirely escapes. The dramatic tension is fundamentally limited by our knowledge of outcomes. Dexter will not be caught in 1991. Harry will not discover a fatal flaw in the code during these 10 episodes. Young Deborah will graduate the academy and become a good cop. The tragedy that awaits all of these characters is already written. The question is whether the journey to that tragedy is interesting enough to sustain attention. For 10 episodes, it largely is. The casting is engaged, the production design is affectionately accurate to early 90s Miami, and the core relationship between Harry and Dexter at this formative stage is handled with enough specificity to feel like it adds something to our understanding of the original series rather than simply restating it. The cancellation is a loss. It's not a catastrophic one, but it's a genuine one. And now let's move forward to the living franchise, to the show that premiered in 2025 and is already on its way to a second season, and to the very strange and somewhat wonderful fact that Dexter Morgan, having been shot by his own son in the snow in upstate New York, is currently alive and operating in New York City. Resurrection premiered in 2025, and the first thing it does is answer a question that New Blood's ending deliberately left hanging. Harrison pulled the trigger. Dexter fell in the snow. Angela called it in as an officer-involved shooting. And yet here we are. Dexter Morgan is alive. The explanation is medical rather than miraculous. Dexter was resuscitated in the emergency room. The wound was survivable if treated quickly enough, which, as it turned out, it was. He was brought back. And then, rather than remaining in any situation where he might be identified and extradited, he left. He is, in the show's first episode, somewhere between recovery and purpose, which for Dexter Morgan has historically meant one specific thing. The decision to set Resurrection in New York City is as deliberate as the decision to set New Blood in Iron Lake. New York is the opposite of small town. It is anonymous in a way that neither Miami nor Iron Lake could offer. You can disappear here, actually disappear, into the volume of people and the scale of the city. And yet there is a very specific reason Dexter has come here, which is Harrison. Harrison is somewhere in New York. Dexter wants to find him. The dynamic between Dexter and Harrison post-New Blood is one of the more genuinely novel elements of the franchise's current phase. Harrison shot his father. Dexter did not die. They are now both alive in the same city, and what they are to each other, what they owe each other, what they want from each other, is complicated in ways that neither a straightforward reconciliation nor a clean estrangement can fully capture. The show appears to be interested in this complexity, and the casting of Jack Alcott in the continuing role of Harrison gives them the material to work with it. The new additions to the cast are, on paper, remarkable. Uma Thurman joins the ensemble in a role whose details were kept relatively close during early promotion. Peter Dinklage plays the season's primary antagonist. The specific character and motivation I won't excavate in full, since Resurrection is still an active, ongoing series, and the specifics are part of what you'd watch it for. What can be said is that Dinklage brings the same quality to his work here that he brought to Game of Thrones, a physical and emotional specificity that tends to elevate whatever material it's applied to. Angel Batista returns, and this is the detail I find most satisfying about Resurrection's ensemble. David Zayas has played Batista across the full lifespan of this franchise, Season 1 of the original series through to now, which is nearly 2 decades of continuous engagement with the same character. And the Batista of Resurrection is doing something the character has never had to do before: navigate his relationship with Dexter while actually knowing what Dexter is. He stood in Iron Lake with the full truth in front of him. He carries that now. The show also continues the hallucinated Harry tradition, or a version of it. Harry appears as what the show describes as a spectral projection, and James Remar returns in the role. This is a slightly different framing from the original series' internal monologue Harry, and the distinction may matter thematically. What was once an internal voice has become something that exists at a slight remove, observable rather than simply heard. The shift in register is consistent with Dexter being, at this stage in his life, a genuinely different person than he was in Miami. The premiere episode, A Beating Heart, drew 3.1 million cross-platform viewers in its opening weekend, breaking the streaming premiere record that Original Sin had set and establishing it as Showtime's most streamed premiere on Paramount+. These are significant numbers for what is, technically, the 4th iteration of a franchise that first aired nearly 2 decades ago. The fact that audiences are still showing up in these numbers suggests that the franchise, at its best, retains genuine cultural purchase. A second season has already been officially ordered. The franchise is not contracting, it is expanding. Here's where things stand as of early 2026 if you want a map of the whole thing. The original series, 8 seasons, 96 episodes, complete. New Blood, 1 season, 10 episodes, complete. Original Sin, 1 season, 10 episodes, complete, canceled before a second season was produced. Resurrection, Season 1 in progress or recently completed, Season 2 ordered. 126 episodes total across 4 separate series, with more coming. That is, by any measure, a substantial fictional universe. built from a premise that was already unusual when it arrived in 2006. A forensic analyst who is also a vigilante serial killer following a code built by his dead police officer father, and a neuropsychiatrist who considered psychopaths a necessary feature of the social ecosystem. This was always going to be either a very short show or a very long one. It turns out to have been a very long one. What I find genuinely interesting about the franchise's current phase is that it is operating in a post-Dexter Morgan world, or trying to. New Blood's ending was designed to be final. Harrison shooting his father was designed to close the loop. Resurrection's resurrection of Dexter undoes that finality, which is a creative risk, but one the franchise seems to be taking with some awareness of what it's doing. The show is not pretending that New Blood didn't happen, it is asking what happens when the ending you wrote turns out not to be the actual ending. I don't think there is a definitive answer yet for whether this is the right choice. It may depend entirely on what Resurrection does with the territory it has opened up. But I'm more curious than skeptical, and given the franchise's recent track record, New Blood being a genuine creative success, Original Sin being at least an interesting attempt, that curiosity feels warranted. And now let me step back from the story itself and talk about the people who made all of this. The showrunners, the composers, the production decisions, and the strange circumstances of a show that filmed most of its Miami story in California. Let me talk about the people behind this because the production history of Dexter is almost as interesting as the show itself, and some of the behind-the-scenes details genuinely reframe how you watch certain seasons. The show's most important creative relationship is between Clyde Phillips and the material. Phillips was the showrunner for the first 4 seasons, the period that aligns almost exactly with the show's critical peak. The Rotten Tomatoes scores from Season 1 through Season 4 run 83%, 96%, 72%, and 88%, all solidly in the realm of critical success, with Season 2's 96% being genuinely exceptional. After Season 4, Phillips left. And the seasons that followed under Chip Johannesson and then Scott Buck, Seasons 5 through 8, scored 84%, 38%, 79%, and 35% respectively. This correlation is not coincidence. Phillips brought to the show a discipline of construction that is most visible in the structure of the episodes and in the way the central dramatic premise was allowed to breathe without being resolved too quickly. The best seasons of Dexter, the ones that still hold up on rewatches, have a quality of inevitability in their plotting. You can feel, watching them, that someone upstream knew exactly where they were going and calibrated each episode's pressure accordingly. Season 4 in particular has this quality almost throughout. The Trinity arc earns its finale because every prior episode has been building load-bearing weight. Phillips returned for New Blood, which was one of the first announcements made when the revival was confirmed. His presence was, rightly, treated as a creative guarantee. And New Blood's critical and commercial success, the fact that it achieved ratings the original show never matched, more than 15 years after the original premiere, is the most concrete possible evidence that his involvement matters. Michael C. Hall's salary across the original series tells its own story about the show's trajectory and the industry's assessment of his contribution. For the first 6 seasons, he earned approximately $295,000 per episode. By seasons 7 and 8, this had risen to approximately $830,000 per episode, more than double. Across the full run, his total compensation exceeded $41 million. Jennifer Carpenter's salary in the final seasons reached approximately $300,000 per episode. These are significant numbers, and they reflect the show's commercial position on premium cable during a period when Showtime was investing heavily in original drama to compete with HBO. Dexter was Showtime's highest-rated original series during its run, and Hall's performance was, correctly, identified as the central load-bearing element of that commercial success. The Hodgkin's lymphoma diagnosis deserves more than a footnote. During the filming of Season 4, the season that contains the best work he ever did for the show, and arguably some of the best individual actor work in prestige cable drama during the period, Michael C. Hall was in active treatment for cancer. He received chemotherapy while continuing to work. The makeup and wardrobe teams worked around the visible effects of treatment, and the condition was not publicly disclosed until January 2010, when Hall accepted his Golden Globe wearing a skull cap and said simply that he was in the middle of treatment. Think about the specific weight of that for a moment. The scene in the season 4 finale, Dexter in the bathroom with Harrison, the complete stillness of it, was performed by an actor who was simultaneously fighting a serious illness. The exhaustion, the quiet, the particular quality of being stripped to essentials that the performance has in those final minutes of the season. I don't know how much of that is acting and how much is simply the truth of where Hall was physically at that time. It is possibly the finest thing he has done in the role, and it was done under those circumstances. Hall and Jennifer Carpenter were married during the filming of the show. Their relationship began in 2008 and ended in 2011, a marriage that lasted roughly from season 3 through season 5. They continued to work together for 3 more seasons after the marriage ended, which is a level of professional commitment that is worth acknowledging without making too much of the personal dimension. Whatever the experience of their relationship was, the on-screen work they did together as brother and sister across 8 seasons is consistently among the show's strongest material. Hall made his directorial debut with the season 8 episode Every Silver Lining, the episode that introduces Dr. Vogel. This is a notable choice. He directed the episode that reframes everything about the origin of the code, the episode that is doing the most significant mythology work in the final season. Daniel Licht composed the score for the original series, and New Blood, a body of work that is more distinctive and more carefully integrated into the storytelling than film and television scores usually get credit for being. The overall aesthetic is eerie, slightly Latin-influenced, with an underlying tension that never quite resolves. Licht's music does not tell you what to feel. It creates an atmosphere in which the story's emotional logic can unfold without being overdetermined. Following Licht's death, Pat Irwin took over composing duties for Resurrection. The opening title theme is by Rolf Kent, and is, in my view, one of the 5 or 6 best television opening sequences of the Prestige cable era. The blood orange being sliced, the eggs cracking in the pan, the dental floss threaded through teeth, each element is mundane in isolation. A morning routine, ordinary domestic ritual. Together, mapped onto the particular context of Dexter's world, they become simultaneously charming and deeply unsettling. The sequence has not changed across the original 8 seasons, which I find impressive. As the show itself shifted and occasionally faltered, the opening stayed the same, a fixed point. The cinematography of the show shifts meaningfully between seasons in ways that are worth knowing about if you're a person who notices these things. Season 1 on 35mm film gives it the texture I mentioned earlier, warm, gritty, slightly imperfect. The transition to digital starting Season 2 produces a cleaner, brighter look that is more conventionally television in its register. The franchise's more recent entries have expanded the aspect ratio. New Blood and Resurrection use an ultra-wide 21.9 ratio, which creates letterboxing on standard displays, but produces a more cinematic image on screens designed for it. Original Sin used an 18.9 ratio. Each change signals a slightly different aspiration for what the show wants to look like. On the awards front, the franchise accumulated more than 100 nominations across major award ceremonies by the end of its original run. It won 4 Primetime Emmys, including the Directing Emmy for The Getaway and the Guest Actor Emmy for John Lithgow. It received a Peabody Award. The AFI listed it among the 10 best television programs of both 2006 and 2007. Michael C. Hall never won the Emmy for acting despite 5 nominations, which is one of the more glaring omissions in the Emmy acting category during that period. He did win the Golden Globe and the SAG Award for Season 4. The CBS broadcast of edited Season 1 episodes during the 2007-08 Writers Guild strike is a footnote that I always enjoy because of its specific absurdity. Showtime content, premium cable, TVMA rated, graphic, and adult, was licensed to CBS for broadcast in the middle of the day and evening, heavily edited to a TV-14 rating to fill the programming gap caused by the strike. The Parents Television Council protested this. Showtime presumably cashed the check and moved on. And the original series was, at one point, described as the most rented DVD box set in Netflix's history. From the era when Netflix was primarily a DVD by mail service, the image of people mailing physical discs back and forth to watch Dexter is the kind of period detail that tends to make you feel the passage of time quite acutely. Now let me talk about what all of this leaves behind. the legacy of Dexter as a franchise and what it meant to the culture it arrived into. Dexter premiered in October 2006. The Sopranos was in its final stretch. The Wire was still running. Breaking Bad was 2 years away. Mad Men was a year away. We were in the middle of, though we didn't quite know it yet, what would later be called the golden age of prestige cable drama. And Dexter was one of the shows that defined what that age was willing to attempt. The specific thing that Dexter attempted, which was genuinely new, was this: make a serial killer the protagonist, make him sympathetic, and sustain that sympathy for 8 seasons without relying on the conventional escape hatch of a redemption arc. Dexter does not stop killing. He does not discover, over time, that he was wrong. He does not become better in any conventional sense. The show asks you to care about someone who is, by any objective definition, a monster. And it does this not through moral relativism or through making his victims sufficiently terrible to justify his existence, but through the quality of Michael C. Hall's performance and the specificity of the character's interiority. The anti-hero tradition in television did not begin with Dexter. Tony Soprano predates it by almost a decade, but Dexter extended the territory in a specific direction. Tony Soprano is a gangster. Walter White is a chemist turned drug manufacturer. These are roles that allow for moral complexity because the crimes committed are, to varying degrees, crimes of choice or circumstance. Dexter's nature is presented as innate, not chosen, not circumstantial, but fundamental. He kills because of what he is, not because of what he decided. This framing asks a more radical question of the audience. Can you sympathize with someone who had no option to be otherwise? The code is what makes this question answerable. The code functions as a pro-social filter, not because it actually makes Dexter good, but because it makes his bad easier to accept. He only kills the guilty. The people he puts on the table are, in the context of the show's moral logic, people who have forfeited their claim to the protections the code theoretically preserves. This is a convenient ethical construction, and the show knows it is convenient. The later seasons become more interesting, not less, as the code's foundations begin to erode, and the question of what Dexter actually is, beneath the vigilante framework, becomes harder to avoid. The vigilante fantasy at the center of the show is worth examining plainly because it is doing a lot of work in the show's cultural resonance. Dexter kills people who escape justice, corrupt officials, child abusers, serial predators, murderers who walked on technicalities. The fantasy being offered is a justice system with no loopholes, a procedure that cannot be gamed by wealth or connections or legal skill. Dexter's code does not accommodate clever lawyers. He is, in the most literal sense, judge, jury, and executioner, and the show invites you to find this satisfying even as it builds, season by season, the case for why it is also horrifying. The character's origins were, Jeff Lindsay has noted, partly inspired by the Brazilian serial killer Pedro Rodrigues Filho, known as Pedrinho Matador, who targeted only other criminals, including fellow prisoners and people he identified as violent offenders. Lindsay took the structure of this real vigilante violence and funneled it through the aesthetic of American prestige drama, adding the forensic expertise, the police department cover, the adoptive father's moral framework, and the specific psychological interiority that Hall's performance would later make indelible. The fandom's relationship with Dexter is, to put it gently, complicated. The show generated some of the most engaged fan communities of its era. People who analyzed the code's internal consistency, who tracked the kill count across seasons, who debated the psychology of Dexter's relationship with Harry in terms that went well beyond casual television consumption. And then season 8 happened, and the finale happened, and the relationship shifted into something more painful. Not the clean disengagement of a fandom that stopped caring, but the specific frustration of one that cared too much and felt let down. New Blood functioned as a kind of franchise therapy, not just for the narrative, completing Dexter's arc in a way that felt earned, but for the fandom's relationship with the show. The fact that New Blood averaged around 8 million viewers per week is not a number you achieve through casual audience interest. That's a number you achieve when people who had withdrawn their engagement return for a specific reason, and that reason is trust. They trusted, given Phillips's return and the general seriousness of the revival's production, that this time it would be handled well. It was. And yet the question of legacy is not fully settled because resurrection complicates it again. If New Blood was the definitive ending, what is resurrection? Is it the franchise acknowledging honestly that it is a commercial property that wants to continue existing? Or is it finding something genuinely new to say with this character in this context? The answer may ultimately be both, which is not necessarily a condemnation. Commercial properties can be commercially motivated and creatively interesting simultaneously. The original series was both. What I find most interesting about the franchise's current phase is that it has for the first time a genuine multi-character mythology outside of Dexter himself. Harrison exists as an ongoing character. Angel Batista exists as an ongoing character. The world that was built around Dexter Morgan is continuing without him as its unambiguous center, or rather with him as a different kind of center, no longer the assumed survivor. He died in New Blood. He is alive in Resurrection. This is a narrative state that the franchise has not previously inhabited, and what it does with the uncertainty is the most interesting open question in the show's current chapter. There is also the matter of the show's influence on what came after it. Dexter's specific combination of psychological interiority, procedural structure, and morally compromised protagonist became, in the years following the show's success, something of a template. You can see individual elements of the Dexter formula in shows ranging from Mindhunter to You, series that are interested in the inner life of violent men and in the gap between exterior performance and interior reality. The specific trope of the unreliable narrator serial killer has become its own genre. Dexter did not invent it. Crime fiction, including the novels the show was based on, had been there long before. But in its television form, Dexter made it viable and commercially sustainable in ways that opened doors for subsequent work. And then there is the most basic legacy, which is simply that the show is still here, 20 years into the franchise, still producing content, still finding audiences, still, at its best moments, capable of delivering the thing it delivered in Season 4. Genuine surprise, genuine emotional weight, the sense of a story being told by people who understand what they are doing. That is not a small thing. Most shows don't survive 8 seasons. A much smaller number survive in the cultural conversation for 15 or 20 years after their premiere. Dexter has, imperfectly, with a controversial middle and a finale it had to eventually walk back, with a prequel that was canceled before it could develop its full potential. But here, still here, that feels worth acknowledging. A show that arrived in 2006 with a premise that could easily have been too dark or too clever or too morally compromised for a mainstream cable audience, that managed to thread that needle through 4 excellent seasons and then struggled, and then came back and managed it again. That is a particular kind of creative achievement that deserves more credit than the conversation about the finale usually allows. And with that said, I think this is probably a good moment to start winding down. We have covered a lot of ground tonight. The specific contribution that Dexter made to the grammar of psychological television is worth being precise about. The inner monologue, the direct access to a character's private reasoning, voiced continuously and unreliably, had been present in literary fiction for a very long time, and in television in various forms. What Dexter did with it was specific. The narration is not a commentary on the action from an exterior vantage point. It is the action much of the time. Dexter narrates his experience as he has it. And because he is a person whose experience of the world is fundamentally different from the viewer's, who perceive situations through a frame that does not include conventional emotional responses to violence, the narration creates a sustained, low-level disorientation in the audience. You are inside a perspective that is not yours. You understand it. You follow it. And then it says something that reminds you gently that you are inside a mind that is categorically different from your own. This technique requires an actor who can sustain a level of interior richness that reads on camera even when the script is, ostensibly, just showing a man bringing donuts to work. Hall manages this across 8 seasons with a consistency that is easy to take for granted and extraordinary when you actually pay attention to it. The flatness, the slight delay in emotional responses, the smile that is always calibrated rather than spontaneous. These are the details of a very specific, very sustained performance, and they make the narration legible because the gap between what Dexter says and what Dexter shows is always perceptible. The show also made a specific contribution to the representation of Miami as a cultural setting, which sounds like a minor point, but I think matters somewhat. Miami had existed in television for decades before Dexter, most notably in Miami Vice, which defined the city's television aesthetic in the 1980s and established a visual vocabulary of tropical excess, violence, and wealth that Dexter both inherited and worked against. Where Miami Vice was kinetic and stylized, Dexter's Miami is suburban and mundane. The violence happens in garages and storage units and repurposed spaces, not in glamorous waterfront confrontations. The city's beauty exists as backdrop rather than subject, and the gap between the postcard Miami and the Miami of traffic jams and unremarkable apartment buildings and forensic labs is part of what the show is doing. Using the aesthetic dissonance between the city's reputation and its reality to mirror the dissonance between Dexter's surface and his depth. The show's treatment of forensic science is also worth acknowledging in the context of its cultural moment. The early 2000s saw an explosion of forensic procedural programming. The CSI franchise, Bones, Crossing Jordan, and their many successors, all of which made forensic science a mainstream entertainment genre. Dexter arrived into this context but did something different with the forensic premise. Rather than using forensic science to catch killers, it used forensic science as the killer's primary tool. Dexter's expertise is weaponized, turned inside out. He is not the detective. He is the most careful criminal, with better knowledge of how crime scenes are read than anyone investigating them. This inversion of the procedural premise is cleaner and more interesting than it might sound. It is also, in retrospect, exactly the kind of formal innovation that defines the best genre television, taking an established formula and finding a way to operate within its conventions, while doing something genuinely unexpected with its assumptions. There is one more element of Dexter's legacy that I want to mention before we close this section, and it is the one that is easiest to overlook because it exists outside the formal record of critical reception and awards tallies. Dexter was, for a significant period, a communal television experience in a way that most prestige drama is not. It was a show that people watched together and debated together, that families and couples and friend groups returned to week after week with specific investment in what was going to happen. The weekly release model, which now feels almost archaic in the era of full-season drops, meant that Dexter occupied a cultural space between releases. It was talked about, speculated about, revisited in the way that serialized drama was talked about before the binge-watch paradigm changed the relationship between audiences and television. The season 4 finale, the reveal of Rita's death, Harrison in the blood, was one of the most widely discussed television moments of its year. Not in the think-piece industrial complex way of current prestige television, where every major story development is immediately contextualized and analyzed by media critics, but in the organic, person-to-person way of an event that people needed to talk to someone else about. I remember the specific quality of conversations the morning after that finale aired. The disbelief, the rewatching of the final sequence to confirm that what had been seen was actually what had been seen. That kind of communal shock is a particular achievement, and it requires both the story and the audience's investment in it to reach a specific pitch simultaneously. Season 4 managed this. The few other finales in the show's history that attempted something similar. The Deborah sees Dexter moment at the end of Season 6, the Lagerta shooting at the end of Season 7, came close and delivered genuine reactions, even if the shared intensity of the Season 4 finale was not quite replicated. New Blood's finale generated its own version of this. The specific, searching conversation about whether Dexter's death was the right ending, whether Harrison did the right thing, whether the franchise had earned its conclusion. This is the kind of conversation that only happens around work that people have a genuine stake in. It is the evidence that the story still matters. That, in the end, is the legacy, not the Emmy count, not the Rotten Tomatoes scores, not the streaming records. Those things are real and worth noting. But the legacy is that people are still having this conversation, that the shipping container and the kill room and the code and the blood slides and Harry's hallucination and Deborah's face in the doorway are still available for extended examination 20 years later. That the show built a world rich enough to keep returning to, and people keep returning to it. We've covered quite a lot of ground tonight. the shipping container and Harry's choice, the code and the kill room and the dark passenger and the long debate about whether it was ever real. Season 1's bloodless crime scenes, Season 2's Bay, Season 3's doomed friendship. The Trinity killer and what he taught Dexter, which is to say the thing he failed to teach him in time, the grief of Season 5 and the strange grace of Lumen's departure, the church, the way Deborah's face looked in the doorway, La Guerta, who was right about everything, new blood and Iron Lake and a white deer and a son who came looking for his father and found something he wasn't entirely prepared for, Harrison pulling the trigger in the snow, Dexter somehow in New York. I've enjoyed spending this time with all of it. Dexter is a show that repays this kind of sustained attention. It is dense enough in its mythology, specific enough in its character work, and imperfect enough in its failures that there is always something to look at closely. The best of it is very good. The worst of it is still interesting. That's more than most things. There are a number of topics I'd love to dig into in future videos on this channel. I want to spend more time with specific characters. Masuka deserves an evening, frankly, and I think a proper deep dive into La Guerta's full arc across 7 seasons would be rich. I'm also thinking about looking at the specific episodes that changed the show. The ones where you can pinpoint the moment a season pivoted into something different. Not just the finales, but the midpoint episodes. The quiet ones that reoriented everything. And at some point, I'd like to spend a proper evening on the original series finale. Not to relitigate the argument about whether it was bad, because I think that argument has been fairly well settled, but to look at what it was actually trying to do and why the ambition and the execution came apart in the specific ways that they did. There is something worth understanding there about the difficulty of ending long stories and about what it means when a show outgrows its initial premise and can't quite find a conclusion adequate to what it became. But that's for another night. Wherever you are tonight, whether you drifted off somewhere around the Bay Harbor Butcher and are now sleeping through the dark passenger section, which is entirely fine, and frankly the point, or whether you've been with me all the way through to Arthur Mitchell and New Blood and all the rest of it. I hope this has been comfortable company. Dexter Morgan is a strange, specifically compelling piece of television fiction. A monster with a code. A father who made something he couldn't quite live with. A son who sat in blood and was found by the wrong person and the right person simultaneously. We keep coming back to this story in one form or another because it keeps having something to say, not always the same thing, but something. Sleep well.